This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I packed my gear, including my trusty 9mm M&P shield. I never go camping without it, just in case. The hike to Snow Lake was beautiful, with the fall colors in full swing. I found a spot a bit off the main trail, wanting some extra privacy. It took me about 4 hours to reach my camping spot, and by the time I set up my tent, I was exhausted. That night, I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the sounds of nature around me. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up, but it was pitch black outside. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed my sleep. Then I heard it, the slow, deliberate sound of my tent zipper being opened. My heart started racing immediately. I lay there, frozen, hoping it was just my imagination. But the sound continued, slow and steady. I could see the tent flap moving in the faint moonlight filtering through the fabric. In that moment, all my training kicked in. I slowly reached for my pistol, which I always keep within arm's reach when I'm camping. My hand was shaking as I gripped it, but I managed to keep my voice steady as I called out, "I have a gun, and I will use it. Leave now." The zipper stopped moving. There was a moment of complete silence that felt like it stretched on forever. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, I heard movement outside the tent. Footsteps crunching on leaves and twigs, moving away from my tent. I didn't dare move. I kept my gun trained on the tent entrance, my finger resting just outside the trigger guard. I was terrified that whoever it was might come back, maybe thinking I was bluffing. After what felt like hours, but was probably only about 30 minutes, I fumbled for my phone with my free hand. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely dial 911. When the operator answered, I whispered my location and what had happened, afraid that speaking too loudly might attract the intruder back. The wait for help was agonizing. Every sound made me jump, a branch snapping in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the wind. Everything sounded like footsteps coming back towards my tent. When I finally heard voices calling out, identifying themselves as forest rangers, I nearly broke down in relief. I unzipped my tent with trembling hands, still clutching my pistol. The rangers were incredibly kind and professional. They searched the area around my campsite and found footprints leading away from my tent. They took my statement and offered to escort me back to the trailhead, an offer I gratefully accepted. As we hiked back in the early morning light, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. I've had my concealed carry permit for years and have done plenty of training, but nothing could have prepared me for the psychological impact of potentially having to use lethal force. I kept replaying the scenario in my head. What if the intruder hadn't left? What if they had called my bluff? Could I have actually pulled the trigger if I needed to? The thought made me feel sick. The rangers did their best to reassure me, telling me I had done everything right. They said it was likely someone looking to steal camping gear and that my warning had scared them off. But I couldn't shake the feeling of violation and vulnerability. When we finally reached the trailhead, I thanked the rangers profusely. One of them gave me his card and encouraged me to reach out if I needed to talk. I appreciated the gesture, but at that moment, all I wanted was to get home and feel safe again. The drive back to Spokane was a blur. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and windows before collapsing on my bed, emotionally and physically drained. It's been several months since that night, and I still have trouble sleeping sometimes. I've gone camping since then, but always with a group. I don't know if I'll ever feel comfortable solo camping again. The experience has made me reflect a lot on the responsibility that comes with carrying a firearm. It's one thing to practice at a range, but facing a real threat is entirely different. The weight of potentially taking a life, even in self-defense, is enormous. I'm grateful that the situation ended without violence, but the what-ifs still haunt me. What if I hadn't woken up? What if I hadn't brought my gun? What were the intruder's intentions? I've talked to a therapist about the experience, which has helped. But there's still a part of me that feels changed by that night. I'm more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings. I appreciate the safety of my home in a way I never did before. I'm sharing this story not to scare anyone, but to remind fellow outdoor enthusiasts to always be prepared and aware. Solo camping can be an incredible experience, but it comes with risks. I was lucky that night, but I know things could have gone very differently. To this day, I still don't know who was trying to get into my tent or what they wanted. Sometimes I find myself scanning faces in crowds, wondering if I'll somehow recognize the person. It's irrational, I know, but it's hard to shake that feeling of unresolved danger. I've thought about reaching out to the forest rangers who helped me that night, just to thank them again. Their calm presence in the aftermath of such a terrifying experience was incredibly comforting. They probably deal with situations like this more often than we realize. In the end, I'm trying to focus on the positives. I handled a dangerous situation as best I could. I trusted my instincts and stood my ground. And most importantly, I survived to tell the tale. But I can't help but wonder about the person who tried to enter my tent. What was going through their mind? Did they realize the danger they were putting themselves in, or were they so desperate that they were willing to risk their life for whatever they thought they might find in a lone camper's tent? These questions will probably never be answered, and I'm learning to be okay with that. Life doesn't always give us neat resolutions or explanations. Sometimes we just have to accept the uncertainty and move forward. I still love the outdoors, and I refuse to let this experience take that away from me. But I approach it differently now. I'm more cautious, more prepared, and more appreciative of the safety that comes with numbers. If there's one thing I want people to take away from my experience, it's this. Trust your instincts, be prepared, and never take your safety for granted. The wilderness is beautiful, but it can also be unpredictable and sometimes dangerous. Respect it, enjoy it, but always be aware. As for me, I'm taking it one day at a time. Each camping trip, each hike, each night spent under the stars is a small victory. A reminder that while that night changed me, it didn't break me. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful. My dad was always the quintessential indoor guy. He loved his tech gadgets, his comfortable recliner, and his predictable routines. The idea of him going camping was about as likely as him suddenly taking up skydiving. He'd never shown any interest in the outdoors, and he barely tolerated our two dogs, Buddy and Max. They were more my mom's project than his. That's why it was so bizarre when he announced out of the blue that he was going on a solo camping trip to the Roll Flake area in the Northwest Territories. We all thought he was joking at first, but then he started buying camping gear, expensive stuff too. He spent hours researching the area online, printing out maps and making lists of supplies. It was like he'd been body snatched. I remember the night before he left. He was so excited, almost giddy. He kept talking about how he needed to reconnect with nature and find himself. Mom and I exchanged worried glances, but we didn't want to rain on his parade. Maybe this was just some kind of midlife crisis thing, we thought. Better camping than buying a sports car or having an affair, right? The morning he left, he hugged us all tightly. He even knelt down and gave Buddy and Max big bear hugs, something I'd never seen him do before. He promised he'd be back in a week, tops. We waved goodbye as he drove off in his newly rented SUV, Buddy and Max's faces pressed against the back window. A week passed. No Dad. We tried calling his cell, but it went straight to voicemail. We figured maybe he'd just lost track of time or the battery had died. But as the days ticked by, the knot in my stomach grew tighter. On day 10, Mom called the RCMP. They took our report seriously, thank God. They immediately dispatched search teams to the Roll Flake area. I remember sitting by the phone, jumping every time it rang, hoping for good news. But the news was never good. They found his campsite, or what was left of it. The tent was still there, along with most of his supplies. His SUV was parked nearby, undamaged. But there was no sign of Dad, Buddy, or Max. It was like they'd just vanished into thin air. The search expanded. They brought in helicopters, drones, and even volunteers from nearby communities. They searched for weeks, covering an enormous area from Yellowknife to Prince George. Nothing, not a single clue. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the reality of the situation started to sink in. My dad was gone. Our dogs were gone. And we had no idea what had happened to them. The theories started flying. Some people thought he might have had an accident, fallen into a ravine or gotten lost in the vast wilderness. But how could the dogs have disappeared too? And wouldn't they have found some trace of them by now? Others suggested maybe he'd planned this, that he'd intentionally disappeared. But that made no sense. My dad was a homebody. He loved his job, his family, his comfortable life. Why would he throw all that away? The not knowing is the worst part. Every time the phone rings, every time there's a knock at the door, I feel that surge of hope. Maybe this is it. Maybe they've found him, but it never is. I've spent countless hours poring over maps of the area, reading about other disappearances in the wilderness, trying to find some clue we might have missed. I've joined online forums dedicated to missing persons cases, hoping someone might have seen something, anything. Mom's a shell of her former self. She barely eats, barely sleeps. I catch her sometimes, just staring at Dad's empty recliner, as if willing him to appear there. The hardest part is the constant oscillation between hope and despair. One day, I'll convince myself that he's still out there somewhere, maybe injured or lost, but alive. The next, I'll be planning his memorial service in my head. And then there are the dreams. I have this recurring nightmare where I'm walking through a dense forest. I can hear Buddy and Max barking in the distance and my dad calling out for help. But no matter how fast I run, I can never reach them. I always wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. The local news covered the story for a while, but interest has waned. To most people, it's just another mysterious disappearance in the vast Canadian wilderness. But to us, it's our entire world turned upside down. I find myself angry sometimes. Angry at my dad for going on this stupid trip in the first place. Angry at the wilderness for swallowing him up. Angry at the universe for not giving us answers. But mostly, I'm just sad. Sad for my mom, who's lost her life partner. Sad for myself, for losing my dad and my dogs all at once. And sad for my dad, wherever he is, whatever happened to him. I keep thinking about that last morning, watching him drive away. If I'd known it was the last time I'd see him, what would I have said? What would I have done differently? Sometimes, when I'm alone, I talk to him. I tell him about my day, about how Mom's doing. about the latest developments in the search. I don't know if he can hear me, but it makes me feel better somehow. I've started going camping myself in the areas where he disappeared. I know it's probably futile, but I can't shake the feeling that if I just look hard enough, I'll find some clue that everyone else missed. So far, all I've found is a deeper appreciation for just how vast and unforgiving the wilderness can be. The RCMP officially scaled back their search after 3 months, but they assure us the case remains open. Cold, but open. They still follow up on any leads that come in, but those are few and far between now. I've become obsessed with other missing persons cases, especially those in wilderness areas. I've joined online communities dedicated to solving these mysteries. Sometimes I think I'm looking for clues to my dad's disappearance. Other times, I think I'm just looking for hope. The Roll Flake area has become both a source of dread and fascination for me. I've studied every inch of it on maps, read every bit of history I can find about the region. It's beautiful, in a stark, unforgiving way. But it's also vast and empty, capable of swallowing a person without a trace. As time passes, I find myself struggling with the idea of moving on. How do you move on when you don't know what you're moving on from? There's no closure, no finality, just an open-ended question mark where my dad used to be. I still have his last voicemail saved on my phone. It's nothing special, just him reminding me to water his plants while he was gone. But it's his voice, proof that he existed, that he was here. Sometimes I play it just to remember what he sounded like. The worst part is the random moments when I forget he's gone. I'll see something funny on TV and think, oh, I need to tell Dad about this. Or I'll be grocery shopping and automatically reach for his favorite snacks. And then it hits me all over again. I don't know if we'll ever know what happened to my dad and our dogs out there in the Roll Flake area. But I do know that I'll never stop looking, never stop hoping for answers. Because somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness of the Northwest Territories, there's a mystery. And at the heart of that mystery is my dad, Buddy, and Max. And until I know what happened to them, a part of me will always be lost in those woods too. I still can't believe what happened on that camping trip last fall. It's been months, but I keep replaying it in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. I guess I should start from the beginning. It was late October, and my boyfriend Jake suggested we go camping with a few of his friends. I'm not usually big on outdoor stuff, but the weather had been unseasonably warm, so I figured why not. We packed up Jake's old pickup truck and headed out to this secluded spot in the woods that his buddy Kevin knew about. The drive out there was actually pretty nice. The fall colors were gorgeous, all orange and red leaves everywhere. We cranked up some music and sang along badly, laughing the whole way. By the time we got to the campsite, I was in a great mood and feeling optimistic about the weekend. We set up our tents, one for Jake and me, and another for Kevin and the other 2 guys, Matt and Chris. As the sun started to set, we got a campfire going and broke out some beers. The night was chilly but clear, with a bright full moon overhead. We roasted hot dogs and marshmallows, told stupid stories, and just hung out. It was actually really fun, way better than I expected. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. I remember being extra careful about locking up the truck, since we had coolers full of food in there. I watched Jake put the keys in the front pocket of his backpack before we crawled into our tent. I fell asleep pretty quickly, feeling content and cozy in my sleeping bag next to Jake. The next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by shouting. At first I was disoriented, not sure where I was or what was happening. Then I heard Kevin yelling, "What the hell?" and saw Jake scrambling out of the tent. I followed him out and froze in shock at the scene in front of me. Our entire campsite was trashed. The fire pit was scattered, with charred logs and ashes strewn all over. Both tents were partially collapsed. Jake's truck had all the doors wide open, and I could see that the stereo had been ripped out and smashed on the ground. There was food everywhere, packages torn open, cans dented and tossed around. It looked like a bear had rampaged through our site. But that didn't make sense. Surely we would have heard something if a bear had done all this damage, right? And there were no claw marks or prints that I could see. Just total chaos and destruction. We all stood there in stunned silence for a minute, trying to process what we were seeing. Then everyone started talking at once, asking what happened and if anyone had heard anything in the night. No one had. I noticed Jake looking pale and shaky. When I asked if he was okay, he hesitated before telling me about a dream he'd had. He said he dreamed that he woke up and saw a figure standing over him in our tent. The figure had a strange mask-like face that was oddly blank and featureless. Jake said in the dream he felt paralyzed and couldn't move or speak. Then he woke up for real when he heard the shouting. A chill ran down my spine hearing this. I wanted to comfort Jake, but I was honestly freaked out myself. As we started trying to clean up the mess, more weird details emerged. The truck keys weren't in Jake's backpack where I know he put them. We found them sitting on the dashboard instead. Some of our clothes and other belongings were scattered in the woods around the campsite. It was like everything had been ransacked. We debated calling the police, but what would we even say? We had no proof of any intruders, and nothing was actually stolen as far as we could tell. Just a ton of senseless destruction. In the end, we just packed up what we could salvage and got the hell out of there. On the drive home, the mood was totally different from the day before. Everyone was tense and quiet, lost in their own thoughts. I kept going over and over the events in my mind, trying to come up with some logical explanation. That's when a disturbing theory started to form. I remembered that Jake had occasional bouts of sleepwalking as a kid. What if he had some kind of episode in the night? Maybe he got up in a dissociative state and trashed everything without realizing it. It would explain how the keys got moved and why no one heard anything. And that creepy figure in his dream could have been his mind's way of processing what happened. I didn't say anything at the time, but that theory haunted me in the weeks that followed. Jake and I started fighting more. He could tell something was off with me, but I didn't know how to bring up my suspicions. Eventually, the strain was too much, and we broke up. To this day, I still don't know for sure what happened that night. Was it Jake? Some kind of animal we somehow slept through? Vandals who managed to sneak in and out without a trace? Or something more inexplicable? All I know is that every time I think about going camping now, I get a knot in my stomach. That one night changed everything, and I'm not sure I'll ever feel truly safe in the woods again. Sometimes I wish I could just forget it all, but the memory of that destroyed campsite is seared into my brain forever. When we arrived at the campsite that Friday afternoon, we realized we'd be sharing the communal areas with another group, 4 guys who looked to be around our age. At first we were a little annoyed to have our girls' weekend crashed, but they seemed friendly enough. We all got to chatting as we set up our tents and settled in. As night fell, we gathered around the fire pit and broke out some drinks. The vibe was fun and lighthearted. We were all laughing and swapping stories about classes and campus life. I remember thinking how nice it was to meet new people and just unwind after the stress of exams. Everything changed in an instant when one of the guys, Matt, started bragging about the gun he'd brought with him. He pulled it out of his bag and began waving it around, acting like he was some kind of action movie hero. My stomach immediately knotted up. I'd never been comfortable around guns, and seeing one being handled so carelessly made me incredibly uneasy. "Dude, put that away. You're being an idiot," one of Matt's friends said. But Matt just laughed it off. "Relax, it's not even loaded," he slurred, clearly drunk. "My dad lets me use it for target practice sometimes." We all protested, telling him to stop and put it away. But he was too drunk and caught up in showing off. What happened next will haunt me for the rest of my life. To prove the gun wasn't loaded, Matt put it to his own head and pulled the trigger. The gun clicked. He grinned and did it again. Another click. My heart was racing. I wanted to run away, to make it stop, but I felt frozen in place. "See, totally safe," Matt drawled. Then he pulled the trigger a third time. The deafening crack of the gunshot shattered the night. For a split second, everything went silent. Then Matt crumpled to the ground as blood began pouring from his head. What followed was pure chaos. People were screaming. Someone was calling 911. I remember one of the guys trying to do CPR, but it was clearly futile. Matt was gone instantly. I don't know how long we all sat there in shock before the police and ambulance arrived. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. We were all questioned extensively. I could barely form coherent sentences as I recounted what had happened. The rest of that night is a blur. I remember being driven back to campus in a police car, still in complete disbelief that this was real. How could a fun camping trip have ended with someone dying right in front of us? In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to process what I'd witnessed. I couldn't sleep without having vivid nightmares of that gunshot replaying over and over. Any loud noise would make me jump out of my skin. I'd burst into tears at random moments, overwhelmed by flashbacks. My grades started slipping as I found it impossible to focus on schoolwork. How could I care about calculus when I'd just seen someone die so senselessly? I withdrew from friends and family, feeling like no one could possibly understand what I was going through. It took months of therapy before I started to feel somewhat normal again. But even now, years later, I still struggle with the trauma of that night. Loud noises still trigger me sometimes. I've never been able to watch movies or TV shows with gun violence. The sound of fireworks on the 4th of July sends me into a panic. What hurts the most is knowing how preventable it all was. If Matt had just listened to us and put the gun away, if he hadn't been drinking, if he'd had even basic gun safety knowledge, so many what-ifs that could have changed everything. I later learned that the gun had belonged to Matt's father, who kept it loaded for home protection. Matt had taken it without permission, not realizing there was a bullet in the chamber. Such a stupid, reckless mistake with devastating consequences. Sometimes I wonder about Matt's family and how they've coped with such a senseless loss. And I think about his friends who were there that night. Do they blame themselves like I sometimes still do? Could any of us have done more to stop him? I know rationally that it wasn't our fault. We all told him to stop. But the guilt still creeps in sometimes. Why didn't I just get up and walk away when he first pulled out the gun? Why didn't I yell louder or try to grab it from him? Deep down, I know there's no point in these thoughts, but they still come. It's been 5 years now since that horrible night. I've managed to mostly move on with my life. I graduated college, started a career, even began dating again after years of avoiding relationships. But I don't think I'll ever be the same carefree person I was before witnessing such a tragic, senseless death. I still love nature and the outdoors, but I've never been able to go camping again. The thought of being in the woods at night brings back too many painful memories. My friends have all but stopped inviting me on trips like that, knowing how much anxiety it causes me. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever fully heal from the trauma of that night. Will I always carry this weight with me? But then I try to remind myself how lucky I am to still be here, to have the chance to live my life. Matt doesn't have that opportunity, so I try to make the most of each day, to find joy where I can. If there's one thing I've learned from this nightmare, it's how fragile life is, how quickly everything can change in an instant. I try to be more present now, to appreciate the little moments, and I'm much more vocal about gun safety. I share my story whenever I can in hopes that it might prevent even one person from making such a deadly mistake. To anyone reading this who might be in a similar situation, please be careful around firearms. Never handle them while drinking. Always assume a gun is loaded, even if you think it isn't. And if you see someone being reckless with a weapon, don't be afraid to speak up or remove yourself from the situation. It could save a life. I wouldn't wish the trauma I've experienced on anyone. That one reckless moment changed so many lives forever. All we can do now is try to learn from it and do better, and hope that by sharing these painful stories, we might prevent future tragedies. I never thought a simple camping trip could change my entire outlook on life. But that's exactly what happened during my solo adventure in Galloway Forest Park. As a born and bred Londoner, I'd always dreamed of escaping the hustle and bustle of city life, even if just for a few days. So when I finally got some time off work, I decided to challenge myself with a solo camping trip in one of the most remote areas of Scotland. The first day was absolutely magical. I hiked for hours through dense forests, marveling at the ancient trees and breathing in the crisp, clean air. It felt like I was the only person for miles around, which was both exhilarating and a bit unnerving. As night fell, I set up my tent in a small clearing, built a campfire, and settled in with a steaming mug of cocoa. The stars were incredible. I'd never seen anything like it in London. I fell asleep feeling peaceful and accomplished. The second day was much the same. I explored more of the forest, took some photos, and even spotted a deer in the distance. That night, I was exhausted from all the hiking, so I turned in early after putting out my campfire. I placed my cocoa mug next to the extinguished fire pit, planning to clean it in the morning. I woke up just as the sun was rising, feeling refreshed and ready for another day of adventure. But as I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, but then I noticed my cocoa mug. It wasn't where I'd left it by the fire pit. Instead, it was sitting on a nearby log about 10 feet away. My heart started racing. I told myself I must have moved it and forgotten, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. With shaking hands, I approached the mug. As I got closer, I noticed something inside it, a blade of grass, intricately knotted into a complex pattern. It was then that the full weight of the situation hit me. Someone had been in my campsite while I slept. I felt sick to my stomach. Whoever it was could have done anything to me while I was vulnerable in my tent. They could have stolen my belongings, or worse. The fact that they chose to leave this subtle, creepy message instead was almost more terrifying. It felt like a warning, or maybe a sick game. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone watching me, but the forest was still and silent. That silence, which had seemed so peaceful yesterday, now felt oppressive and threatening. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In that moment, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here another night. I needed to get back to civilization, back to safety. I quickly packed up my tent and gear, my hands fumbling with the straps as I kept glancing over my shoulder. According to my map, the nearest town was about 13 hours away on foot. It was a daunting journey, but the alternative, spending another night out here with my mysterious visitor potentially lurking nearby, was unthinkable. So I started walking, and walking, and walking. The beautiful scenery that had captivated me yesterday now seemed sinister. Every shadow could be hiding someone. Every sound could be footsteps following me. I didn't stop for breaks. I barely even paused to take sips of water. The weight of my backpack dug into my shoulders, and my feet began to ache, but I pushed on. As the hours ticked by, my paranoia grew. I kept imagining I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. At one point, I thought I heard whistling in the distance, and I nearly broke into a run. But I forced myself to keep a steady pace. I couldn't afford to get lost or injured out here. The sun began to set, and I realized with growing dread that I'd have to spend at least part of this journey in the dark. I flicked on my headlamp, but the small circle of light it cast only seemed to emphasize how vast and dark the forest was around me. Every tree trunk looked like a person. Every rustle sounded like footsteps. As night fully fell, my exhaustion began to compete with my fear. I'd been walking for over 10 hours at this point, fueled by adrenaline and terror. My legs felt like lead, and I was starting to stumble over roots and rocks. But I couldn't stop. The memory of that knotted grass blade kept me going, along with the certainty that if I stopped, whoever left it would find me again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw lights in the distance. A wave of relief washed over me so strong it nearly brought me to my tears. I practically ran the last mile into town, not caring how I must have looked, a wild-eyed, exhausted man bursting out of the forest in the middle of the night. I found a small inn that, miraculously, had a room available. The innkeeper gave me an odd look but didn't ask questions. As soon as I was in the room, I locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle for good measure, and collapsed onto the bed. I was safe. I was back in civilization. It's been weeks since that night, and I still can't shake the feeling of being watched. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just some other camper playing a prank, or maybe I sleepwalked and did it myself. But deep down, I know what happened. Someone was there, someone who could have hurt me but chose to leave a warning instead. I haven't been camping since, and I'm not sure I ever will again. The experience changed something fundamental in me. I used to see nature as an escape, a peaceful retreat from the chaos of city life. Now I understand the vulnerability of being truly alone in the wilderness, cut off from help and exposed to unknown dangers, both natural and human. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I still see that knotted blade of grass in my mind. I wonder who left it and why. Were they trying to scare me off? Was it a twisted game? Or was it a genuine warning of some greater danger lurking in those woods? I'll never know for sure, and that uncertainty haunts me. I've tried to tell this story to friends, but they either don't believe me or think I'm overreacting. They don't understand the psychological impact of feeling watched, of knowing someone invaded your space while you were at your most vulnerable. How do you explain the terror of realizing you're not as alone as you thought, especially when you're miles from any help? This experience taught me a harsh lesson about the world and my place in it. It's not that I don't trust nature anymore, or that I'm afraid of every shadow, but I've lost that naive sense of invulnerability I once had. I know now that danger can find you anywhere, even in the most beautiful and seemingly peaceful places. And sometimes, the most terrifying things are the ones you can't see, the presence you can only feel, watching and waiting in the darkness. Jake and I are film students at the local university, always on the lookout for interesting projects. We'd heard rumors about Blackwood Forest being haunted for years, stories of strange noises, eerie lights, and people going missing. Most folks around here just laughed it off as urban legends, but Jake got the idea to make a short documentary exploring the myths. I was hesitant at first, but he convinced me it would be a cool project for our cinematography class. We headed out to Blackwood early Saturday morning, loaded up with camera gear and enough supplies for a full day of shooting. The forest was dense and dark, with towering pines blocking out most of the sunlight. As we hiked deeper in, following an overgrown trail, I started to feel uneasy. The woods were unnaturally quiet, no birds chirping, no rustle of small animals, just an oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Jake was in his element, though, excitedly narrating as we walked. Local legend says the Blackwood Witch cursed these woods over 100 years ago, he explained to the camera. Since then, dozens of hikers and campers have reportedly vanished without a trace. I rolled my eyes at his dramatics, but I have to admit the stories were starting to get to me a bit. Every shadow looked like it was moving. Every snapping twig made me jump. We pressed on for another hour or so, getting deeper into the heart of the forest. That's when we stumbled across the cave entrance. It was partially hidden behind some thick brush, but unmistakable once we cleared it away. A yawning black mouth in the hillside, leading down into darkness. Jake's eyes lit up. "Dude, this is perfect. Let's check it out." I tried to protest, but he was already setting up the camera and lights. Reluctantly, I followed him into the cave. The temperature dropped immediately as we entered, and I shivered despite my jacket. Our flashlight beams barely penetrated the inky blackness ahead. We'd only gone about 50 feet in when we heard it, a low, guttural moan echoing from deeper in the cave. Jake and I froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, face pale in the dim light. Then we heard it again, louder this time. It didn't sound human or animal, just wrong somehow. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but Jake, ever the filmmaker, raised his camera and started moving towards the sound. I grabbed his arm. "Are you insane? We need to get out of here." He shook me off. "It's probably just the wind or something. Come on, this could be amazing footage." Before I could argue further, a blast of icy air hit us, extinguishing our flashlights and plunging us into total darkness. I heard Jake curse and fumble with his light. In those few seconds of blindness, the moaning sound changed to a high-pitched shriek that set my teeth on edge. When Jake finally got his flashlight working again, I nearly screamed. There, at the edge of the light, I saw a mass of writhing shadows. They seemed to pulse and twist, taking vaguely human shapes before dissolving again, and they were moving towards us. We ran. I've never moved so fast in my life, scrambling over rocks and roots as we fled back towards the cave entrance. The shadows pursued us, always just out of reach. I could feel their cold breath on the back of my neck. We burst out of the cave into the fading daylight, gasping for breath. But our relief was short-lived. As we looked around wildly, we realized we were surrounded by 3 figures dressed all in black. Their faces were hidden by dark hoods, and they moved with an unnatural stillness. Jake and I backed away slowly, but they matched our movements step for step. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of sick prank or hallucination. Suddenly, one of the figures lunged forward. I saw a flash of steel, a knife, and heard Jake cry out in pain. Without thinking, I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it with all my might at our attacker's head. There was a sickening crack, and the figure crumpled to the ground. The other 2 advanced on us, but before they could reach us, a booming voice rang out, "Freeze! Park Rangers!" I've never been so relieved to see a man in uniform. The ranger, a burly guy named Mike according to his badge, came charging through the trees with his gun drawn. The 2 remaining figures melted into the woods like smoke, leaving their fallen comrade behind. As Mike radioed for backup and an ambulance, I checked on Jake. He had a nasty gash on his arm, but it didn't look too deep. We were both shaken, but alive. The guy I'd hit was just starting to come around as more rangers and paramedics arrived. They hauled him to his feet, pulling back his hood to reveal a gaunt face with wild eyes. What struck me most was the intricate rose tattoo on his neck, the red ink a stark contrast to his pale skin. When the rangers questioned him about why he and his friends had attacked us, he just grinned maniacally and said, "Because we could." A chill ran down my spine at the casual malice in his voice. The next few hours were a blur of police statements and medical checks. They never found the other 2 attackers, despite an extensive search of the area. Jake needed a few stitches, but we were both cleared to go home eventually. As we were leaving, I overheard Mike the Ranger talking to one of his colleagues. "Third incident this month," he was saying in a low voice. "Something's not right in these woods." It's been a week now, and I still can't shake the feeling of dread when I think about what happened. Jake's been oddly quiet, throwing himself into editing the footage we managed to salvage. He says he wants to finish the documentary, but I can't bring myself to watch it. Every time I close my eyes, I see those writhing shadows reaching for me. I don't know if what we experienced was supernatural or just some twisted humans playing sick games. But I do know that I'll never set foot in Blackwood Forest again. Some places are better left unexplored, some stories better left untold. I just hope that by sharing this, I can warn others to stay away. Because whatever is in those woods, it's hungry and it's waiting. We had been planning this trip for months, excited to spend a few days hiking and camping in a remote wilderness area about 3 hours from our hometown. As college students, we didn't have a lot of money, but we managed to scrape together enough for basic supplies and gas for Jess's old Subaru. The day of the trip finally arrived, and we set off early in the morning, singing along to 90s pop songs and talking about all the fun we were going to have. About halfway through the drive, we stopped at a small gas station in the middle of nowhere to fill up and grab some snacks. That's when things started to feel off. As I was browsing the chip aisle, I noticed a scruffy-looking man in his 40s or 50s watching us intently from across the store. He was tall and burly with long, greasy hair and a thick beard. Something about the way he was staring made my skin crawl. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling as we went to check out. To our surprise, the man approached us at the counter and offered to buy us some beer, saying we looked like we could use a good time. We politely declined, but he was insistent, eventually purchasing a 12-pack and basically forcing it on us. We awkwardly thanked him and hurried out to the car. "That was weird, right?" Katie said as we pulled away. "Super creepy," Jess agreed. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man watching us leave from the parking lot. A chill ran down my spine. We tried to laugh it off as we continued our drive, but I couldn't quite shake my uneasiness. When we finally arrived at the campsite late that afternoon, I felt a wave of relief. We were truly in the middle of nowhere, no cell service, no other campers around for miles, just us girls and the great outdoors. We set up our tent, built a fire, and cracked open a few of the beers as the sun began to set. Despite my lingering anxiety from earlier, I started to relax and enjoy myself. We roasted hot dogs, made s'mores, and stayed up late talking and laughing under the stars. It must have been close to midnight when we decided to turn in. We zipped up the tent and snuggled into our sleeping bags, excited for a full day of hiking ahead. I drifted off quickly, lulled by the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. I'm not sure how long I was asleep before I jolted awake, heart racing. Something had woken me up, but I wasn't sure what. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. They were slow and deliberate, getting closer and closer to our tent. I reached over and shook Jess awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered urgently. She nodded, eyes wide with fear. We woke Katie and huddled together, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps circled our tent once, twice, 3 times. Then they stopped directly in front of the entrance. We could see a large shadow looming through the thin fabric. Suddenly, a gravelly voice spoke. "I know you girls are in there. Why don't you come on out and have some fun?" I had to clamp a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. It was him, the man from the gas station. How had he found us? What did he want? "Don't make me come in there and get you," he growled when we didn't respond. Panic overtook me. I fumbled for my phone, forgetting we had no service. Katie was softly crying. Jess looked like she was about to be sick. The zipper of the tent began to slowly open. In that moment, survival instinct kicked in. "Run!" I shouted, unzipping the opposite side of the tent. We burst out into the darkness, sprinting blindly through the woods. I could hear heavy footfalls and angry shouting behind us, but I didn't dare look back. Branches whipped at my face and I tripped several times, but pure adrenaline kept me going. We ran for what felt like hours until we finally stumbled onto a dirt road. By some miracle, an old pickup truck was approaching. We frantically waved it down, sobbing and begging the confused elderly couple inside for help. They drove us to the nearest police station, where we filed a report. The officers were sympathetic, but said there wasn't much they could do without more information. They took us to a motel for the night and promised to check out our campsite in the morning. We never went back to retrieve our stuff. We just wanted to get home and try to forget the whole ordeal. The police called a few days later to say they hadn't found any sign of the man or any evidence of wrongdoing at our campsite. It's been almost a year, and I still have nightmares about that night. I keep wondering, what would have happened if we hadn't gotten away? What were his intentions? How did he find us? I doubt I'll ever know the answers. But one thing's for certain, I'm never going camping again. The 4 of us had been planning this hike for weeks. We'd found a trail about 2 hours from the city that was supposed to have amazing views. The weather forecast wasn't great, cloudy with a chance of rain, but we figured we'd go anyway. We could always turn back if it got too bad. We set off early that morning in my old SUV. The drive out was pretty uneventful. We chatted and joked around, stopping for coffee and snacks. It started drizzling about an hour in, but nothing too heavy. As we got further from the city, the roads became more remote. The last 30 minutes or so was on this winding back road through dense forest. There were hardly any other cars. I remember thinking how isolated it felt out there. We were maybe 10 minutes from the trailhead when I spotted someone walking along the side of the road up ahead. As we got closer, I could see it was a woman. She was absolutely drenched, her clothes clinging to her. "Hey, should we stop and see if she needs help?" I asked the others. We all agreed it seemed like the right thing to do. I pulled over about 20 feet ahead of her and put my hazards on. I rolled down the window as she approached. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride somewhere?" I called out. She came right up to the car. Now that I could see her clearly, something felt off. Her eyes had this wild, desperate look. Before I could react, she yanked open the driver's side door. "Move over," she snarled, brandishing what looked like a large hunting knife. I froze in shock. Was this really happening? The woman climbed in, wedging herself between me and the steering wheel. She jabbed the knife towards my ribs. "Drive," she ordered, "and don't try anything stupid." My heart was racing as I put the car in gear and pulled back onto the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the terrified faces of my wife and friends. "Where are we going?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. "Just drive," she snapped. "I'll tell you when to stop." We drove in tense silence for about 15 minutes. The woman kept glancing behind us, as if checking we weren't being followed. Finally, she told me to pull over onto a small dirt track leading into the woods. "Turn off the engine and give me your phone," she demanded. I complied, hands trembling. She grabbed my phone and smashed it on the dashboard. "Phones. Now. All of you," she yelled to the others. They quickly handed them over, and she destroyed each one. Wallets, too, and any jewelry. We all emptied our pockets. I watched helplessly as she pocketed several $100s in cash, plus our credit cards and my wife's necklace. "Please," my wife whimpered. "Just take what you want and go. We won't tell anyone." The woman's eyes flashed dangerously. "Shut up. I'm not done yet." She turned back to me. "You're going to drive me a bit further. The rest of you, get out." "No," I protested. "I'm not leaving them here." She pressed the knife harder against me. I could feel the point digging into my side. "Do it, or I start cutting." Trembling, Jay, Kintabi, and my wife climbed out of the car. The rain was coming down harder now. They huddled together, looking lost and afraid. "Now drive," the woman ordered. I put the car in gear, sick with fear about what she might do to me. We bumped along the muddy track for another 5 minutes or so before she told me to stop. "Get out," she said. I did as I was told, my legs feeling like jelly. She climbed into the driver's seat. "Please," I begged, "don't take our car. We're miles from anywhere." She just laughed. "Should have thought of that before you stopped to help a stranger." And with that, she slammed the door and sped off, spraying me with mud. I stood there in shock for a few moments, the rain soaking through my clothes. Then I sprinted back down the track towards where I'd left the others. They were right where I'd left them, huddled under a large tree for meager shelter. My wife burst into tears when she saw me. We clung to each other, all of us shaken and confused by what had just happened. "What do we do now?" Kintabi asked. It was a good question. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere with no phones, no transportation, and no real idea where we even were. The hike we'd planned was still miles away. In the end, we started walking back the way we'd come. It was miserable, cold, wet, and eerily quiet, except for the sound of rain on leaves. Every snapping twig made us jump. After what felt like hours, we finally reached the main road. But even then, It was at least an hour before a car came by. An older couple eventually stopped and let us use their phone to call for help. The police came and took our statements, but they never found the woman or our car. They think she must have been part of some kind of gang operating in the area, targeting isolated vehicles. It's been months now, but I still have nightmares about those wild eyes and that knife pressed against me. I can't shake the feeling of violation, not just the robbery, but how easily our fun day out turned into a nightmare. We were lucky, I know. It could have been so much worse. But the experience has left its mark on all of us. I'm jumpy and paranoid now, especially when driving in rural areas. My wife has panic attacks if she sees someone walking alone on the side of the road. I keep replaying it in my head, wondering if there were signs we missed. Should we have known better than to stop? But then I think, in that moment, we were just trying to help someone who seemed to be in trouble. How could we have known it would turn out like this? I don't have any grand conclusions or life lessons to share. I'm still trying to process it all, to be honest. I guess I just wanted to get it off my chest, to tell someone who might understand, and maybe to warn others. Be careful out there. You never know when a simple act of kindness might put you in danger. We'd been dating for about 6 months and decided to try out this new trail we'd heard about from some friends. It was a bit off the beaten path, but the pictures online looked gorgeous, all lush green forest and scenic overlooks. Casey was really excited about it and had been planning our route all week. We got an early start that Saturday morning, packing our backpacks with trail mix, sandwiches, and plenty of water. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot. As we pulled into the small gravel parking lot at the trailhead, I remember feeling so happy and relaxed. If only I'd known what was coming. The first couple hours of the hike were great. The trail wasn't too crowded and the scenery was even more beautiful than the pictures online. We stopped for lunch at this amazing viewpoint overlooking a valley. Casey was in such a good mood, laughing and joking around. Everything felt so normal. It was shortly after we started hiking again that things began to get weird. We came to a fork in the trail, and Casey insisted we take the path to the right, even though my trail map clearly showed we needed to go left. When I tried to show her the map, she got weirdly defensive and agitated. I figured she was just tired and frustrated, so I let it go, and we went right like she wanted. About 20 minutes later, I realized we were definitely off course. The trail was getting overgrown, and I couldn't find any of the landmarks we were supposed to be seeing. I gently suggested we turn back, but Casey refused. She started walking faster, almost frantically. When I called out for her to slow down, she whirled around with this wild look in her eyes that I'd never seen before. "We have to keep going," she said in a low, urgent voice. "They're coming for us. We can't let them catch us." I was totally confused. "Who's coming for us? Casey, what are you talking about?" But she just shook her head and kept pushing forward through the underbrush. I followed, calling her name, but it was like she couldn't even hear me. Her movements were jerky and erratic. A few times she stumbled and fell, scraping her arms and legs, but she barely seemed to notice. I was starting to get seriously freaked out. This wasn't like Casey at all. She's usually so level-headed and rational. I wondered if she was having some kind of mental breakdown. Should I try to restrain her? Call for help? But we were miles from the trailhead with no cell service. Things escalated quickly after that. Casey started mumbling to herself, swatting at invisible things in the air. When I tried to grab her arm to stop her, she violently shoved me away. I stumbled backwards and fell hard, the wind knocked out of me. Before I could get up, Casey was on top of me, her eyes wild and unfocused. "You're one of them," she shrieked. "You've been lying to me this whole time." I tried to reason with her, to calm her down, but it was useless. She started hitting me, clawing at my face and arms. I couldn't believe this was happening. My sweet, gentle girlfriend had turned into some kind of feral animal. I managed to push her off and scramble to my feet, but she lunged at me again. We grappled and fell to the ground, rolling down a small incline. I hit my head on a rock and saw stars. Casey was still on top of me, her hands now wrapped around my throat. "I won't let you take me," she screamed. "I'd rather die." I struggled to breathe, to pry her hands away. Black spots danced in my vision. In desperation, I grabbed a stick from the ground and swung it at her head. It connected with a sickening thud, and Casey collapsed on top of me, unconscious. For a moment, I just lay there, gasping for air, my mind reeling. What the hell just happened? Was this all some kind of nightmare? But the pain in my throat and the weight of Casey's limp body were all too real. I gently rolled her off me and checked her pulse, terrified that I might have really hurt her. To my immense relief, it was steady and strong. She had a small cut on her forehead where the stick had hit her, but otherwise seemed okay. I sat there for what felt like hours, cradling Casey's head in my lap, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had she been drugged somehow? Was it some kind of psychotic break? I racked my brain but couldn't come up with any explanation that made sense. Eventually, Casey started to stir. She blinked up at me, confusion clouding her features. What happened?" she mumbled. "Where are we?" I helped her sit up slowly, watching her carefully for any signs of aggression. But the wild, manic energy from before was gone. She just looked tired and dazed. "Do you remember anything?" I asked cautiously. Casey shook her head, wincing. "The last thing I remember is eating lunch at that viewpoint. How did we get here? And why does my head hurt?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to tell her. "You had some kind of episode," I said finally. "You weren't yourself. You got really paranoid and aggressive. You thought someone was after us." Casey's eyes widened in shock and dismay. "What? No, that can't be right. I would never— Oh God, did I hurt you?" She reached out to touch the bruises forming on my neck, horror dawning on her face. I caught her hand gently. "It's okay. You weren't in control. The important thing is, you're back to normal now." Casey burst into tears, overwhelmed and confused. I held her as she sobbed, my own emotions a tangled mess of relief, lingering fear, and utter bewilderment. When she had calmed down a bit, we slowly made our way back to the main trail. Casey was still weak and disoriented, so our progress was slow. Neither of us talked much. What was there to say? It was nearly dark by the time we made it back to the car. The drive home was tense and quiet. Casey kept apologizing, clearly horrified by what I'd told her, even though she had no memory of it. I assured her it wasn't her fault, but honestly, I was still pretty shaken up. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of what happened. Casey got checked out by a doctor, but all her tests came back normal. No signs of any drugs in her system, no underlying health issues that could explain the episode. The only theory I could come up with was that maybe she'd been exposed to some kind of toxic plant on the trail, something hallucinogenic that triggered a temporary psychosis. I'd heard stories of hikers having bad reactions to certain plants before. but it still didn't fully explain the sudden onset or the total memory loss. We never went back to that trail again. In fact, we didn't go hiking at all for months afterwards. The whole experience left us both pretty traumatized. Even now, years later, I still get a chill down my spine when I think about that day. Casey and I are still together, and nothing like that has ever happened again. But sometimes I catch her looking at me with a hint of fear in her eyes, like she's afraid of losing control again. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't sometimes wonder if it could happen again. I've never been able to fully explain what happened that day on the trail. Was it some kind of freak medical event? A paranormal experience? Or just really bad luck with some poisonous plants? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but one thing's for sure. I'll never forget the day my girlfriend turned into a stranger before my eyes. The day started like any other. I was on duty at the main pool, keeping an eye on the guests and making sure everyone was safe. Around midday, I noticed this guy hanging around near a group of women who were lounging by the pool. At first, I didn't think much of it, but something about him just seemed off. He kept inching closer to them, trying to strike up conversations, even though they clearly weren't interested. I watched him for a while, and it became obvious he was making them uncomfortable. The women were exchanging worried glances and shifting away from him. That's when I decided to intervene. I walked over casually, pretending to check on the water quality near them. "Everything all right here, ladies?" I asked, making sure to position myself between them and the creepy guy. One of the women, a blonde in her 30s, gave me a relieved look. "We're fine, thanks," she said, but her eyes told a different story. I turned to the man. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to give these ladies some space. We want all our guests to feel comfortable here." He scowled at me, but didn't argue. He skulked off, muttering under his breath. I made a mental note to keep an eye out for him for the rest of my shift. The women thanked me, and I learned they were a group of friends on a girls' getaway. One of them, Abby, struck up a conversation with me. She was friendly and outgoing, with a warm smile that made me feel instantly at ease. We chatted for a bit, and she mentioned they were planning a night hike later that evening to stargaze. "You should join us if you're free," she said. "The more, the merrier." I was tempted, but I hesitated. "I don't know. I'm not sure if I should fraternize with guests." Abby laughed. "Come on. It's not like we're asking you to break any major rules. It's just a friendly hike. Besides, after what happened earlier, we'd feel safer with you around." I couldn't argue with that logic, and if I'm being honest, I was kind of into Abby. So I agreed to meet them at the trailhead after my shift ended. The rest of the day passed without incident, and I found myself looking forward to the hike more and more. When I got off work, I quickly changed and headed to the meeting spot. The group was already there. Abby, her 4 friends, and a couple of other resort guests who decided to join in. We set off up the trail, chatting and laughing as we went. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. As it got darker, we switched on our flashlights and headlamps. The mood was light and fun, but I couldn't shake this nagging feeling that something was off. About an hour into the hike, we reached a clearing with a stunning view of the valley below. We paused to catch our breath and take in the scenery. That's when I heard it, a twig snapping in the darkness behind us. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the trees. "Did anyone hear that?" The others looked at me, confused. "Hear what?" one of Abby's friends asked. "I thought I heard something in the woods," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I didn't want to freak everyone out, but my instincts were screaming that something was wrong. We stood in silence for a moment, straining our ears. Then we all heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. And they were getting closer. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" No response. Just more footsteps, faster now. Panic set in. "We need to go," I said urgently. "Now." We turned and started hurrying back down the trail. I took the lead, with Abby right behind me. The others followed, their voices rising in fear as we heard the footsteps behind us, no longer trying to be stealthy. "What's happening?" someone cried out. "Just keep moving," I shouted back. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. We were almost running now, stumbling over roots and rocks in our haste. The footsteps behind us broke into a run too. Whoever it was, they were gaining on us. Suddenly, I felt something grab my ankle. I went down hard, face planting into the dirt. Pain exploded in my nose, and I tasted blood. "Help!" I yelled, trying to kick free. But the grip on my ankle was like iron. I rolled over, shining my flashlight at my attacker. My blood ran cold when I recognized him. It was the creep from the pool earlier. But now he was wearing a maintenance uniform, a wicked-looking knife gleaming in his other hand. "You should have minded your own business," he snarled, raising the knife. I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact. But it never came. Instead, I heard a dull thud and a grunt of pain. My eyes flew open to see Abby standing over the man, a large branch in her hands. She'd clocked him right in the head. The man's grip on my ankle loosened, and I scrambled away. Abby helped me to my feet, and we both stared at the unconscious form on the ground. "Is he—" I couldn't finish the sentence. Abby knelt down and checked his pulse. "He's alive, just knocked out." The others had circled back when they realized I'd fallen. Now they stood around us, shocked and terrified. "What do we do?" someone asked. I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "We need to get back to the resort and call the police. And security. This guy, he works here, or at least he has a uniform." We used some extra shoelaces to tie the man's hands behind his back, just in case he woke up. Then, supporting each other, we made our way back down the mountain as quickly as we could. The next few hours were a blur of police statements and medical checks. It turned out the guy was indeed a maintenance worker at the resort, but he had a history of stalking and assault charges in other states. He'd been using his job to target female guests, and we'd interrupted his latest attempt. As the night wore on and the adrenaline wore off, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. If Abby hadn't been there, if she hadn't acted so quickly, I shuddered to think how differently things could have turned out. The police eventually left, promising to keep us updated on the case. As the group began to disperse, heading back to their rooms, Abby lingered. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes full of concern. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was being entirely truthful. "Yeah, I think so. Thanks to you. You saved my life back there." She smiled, but it was a tired, shaky smile. "We saved each other. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there to warn us in the first place." We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the night's events hanging between us. Then, without warning, Abby threw her arms around me in a tight hug. I hugged her back, feeling the tremors running through her body. "I'm so glad you're okay," she whispered. When we finally pulled apart, I found myself not wanting to let go, but it was late and we were both exhausted. "Get some rest," I said. "We can talk more tomorrow if you want." Abby nodded and started to walk away, but she paused and turned back. "Hey, thank you for everything." As I watched her disappear into the resort, I was struck by how quickly life can change. In the span of a single day, I'd gone from a routine shift at the pool to a life-or-death situation in the mountains, and somehow I'd made it through. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the glint of that knife, felt the iron grip on my ankle. But I also saw Abby, standing over me with that branch, saving my life. The next morning, I gave my statement to the resort management. They were horrified by what had happened and assured me they would be implementing stricter background checks and security measures. They offered me time off, but honestly, I didn't want to be alone with my thoughts. So I went back to work, trying to pretend everything was normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. I jumped at every unexpected noise, scrutinized every guest who looked even slightly suspicious. The carefree atmosphere of the resort now seemed like a thin veneer, hiding potential dangers. Abby and her friends checked out that day. Before she left, she came to see me at the pool. We exchanged numbers, promising to keep in touch. As I watched her car drive away, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that she was safe, heading home away from this place that now held such terrifying memories. Sadness because, despite the circumstances, I'd felt a real connection with her. The rest of the summer passed in a haze. I finished out my contract at the resort, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. Every time I looked at the mountains, I remembered that night, the fear, the helplessness. It's been months now, and I still have nightmares sometimes. I wake up in a cold sweat, feeling that hand on my ankle, seeing that knife. But I'm working through it. Therapy helps, and Abby and I still talk regularly. We're planning to meet up soon to talk about everything in person. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe again. That night showed me how quickly things can go wrong, how darkness can be hiding just out of sight. But it also showed me the strength of human connection, how strangers can become allies in the face of danger. I'm not the same person I was before that night. I'm more cautious, more aware. But I'm also more appreciative of the good in people. Because for every monster lurking in the shadows, there's an Abby out there, ready to stand up and fight back. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. I'll never take a peaceful day for granted again, and I'll always, always trust my instincts. I still can't shake the feeling of unease when I think back to that hiking trip last summer. What started as a fun adventure with my boyfriend Roger turned into something I'll never be able to explain. We had been planning this backpacking trip for months, a challenging 3-day trek through Glacier National Park. Roger and I are experienced hikers, but this was going to push our limits. The views were supposed to be incredible, though, so we were excited to give it a shot. The first day started off great. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot. We made good time on the trail, taking in the breathtaking mountain vistas. Around midday, we crossed paths with another couple heading the same direction. They introduced themselves as Mike and Jennifer. They seemed friendly enough, so we chatted for a bit as we hiked. At first, the conversation was normal, where we were from, how long we'd been hiking, that sort of thing. But then Mike made an odd comment about how he loved watching people sleep under the stars. The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at Roger, but he didn't seem to notice anything strange. As we continued on, Jennifer kept asking very personal questions about our relationship. How long had we been together? Did we live together? Were we planning on getting married soon? It felt invasive, but I tried to brush it off as her just being overly friendly. When we stopped for a quick snack break, I noticed Mike staring at me intensely, not in a flirtatious way, but almost hungrily. I tried to shake off the paranoid thoughts. They were just fellow hikers, after all. We parted ways with Mike and Jennifer in the afternoon, as they were planning to take a different route. Roger and I found a nice spot to set up camp for the night. As the sun started to set, we got a campfire going and made dinner. I was just starting to relax when I heard a twig snap nearby. I whipped my head around and could have sworn I saw a shadow duck behind a tree. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Roger. He shook his head, looking confused. A few minutes later, I definitely heard footsteps. Roger heard it too this time. We called out, asking if anyone was there. No response. Roger got up to investigate, shining his flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. We tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. As we got ready for bed, I kept seeing flashes of movement out of the corner of my eye. Every time I looked directly, there was nothing there. I tossed and turned all night, unable to fall into a deep sleep. Around 3 a.m., I jolted awake. There was definitely someone, or something, moving around outside our tent. I nudged Roger awake, my heart pounding. We heard hushed whispers, then footsteps circling our tent. Roger unzipped the tent flap and shone the flashlight out. For a split second, I saw two figures dart behind some trees. "Hello?" Roger called out. Silence. We were both wide awake now, adrenaline coursing through our veins. We debated packing up and hiking out in the middle of the night, but ultimately decided it was too dangerous in the dark. The rest of the night passed agonizingly slowly. Every sound made me jump. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, we quickly packed up our gear. I've never broken down a campsite so fast in my life. We practically jogged down the trail, both of us on high alert. About an hour into our hike, we ran into a park ranger. We told him about the strange occurrences during the night and mentioned Mike and Jennifer. The ranger's face went pale. "Did you say Mike and Jennifer?" he asked. We nodded. He pulled out his phone and showed us a news article from 2 years ago. My blood ran cold as I read the headline, "Couple found dead on Glacier National Park Trail." The article went on to describe how Mike and Jennifer Thompson, experienced hikers in their 30s, had been found dead under mysterious circumstances. The cause was never determined. The photos matched the couple we had met on the trail. I felt like I was going to be sick. How was this possible? We had talked to them, hiked with them. They were real people. The ranger radioed for backup and told us to wait with him. More rangers arrived and took our statements. They searched the area but found no trace of the couple we described. Roger and I were in shock. We cut our trip short and headed home that day. It's been months, and I still can't make sense of what happened. Were we hallucinating? Was it some kind of shared delusion brought on by altitude and exhaustion? Or did we really encounter something supernatural? I've done endless research trying to find an explanation. I've read about skinwalkers, doppelgangers, all sorts of paranormal phenomena. Nothing quite fits. Roger doesn't like to talk about it. I think it freaks him out too much. But I can't stop thinking about it. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear whispers outside my window. I'll see a familiar silhouette out of the corner of my eye, only for it to vanish when I look directly. Am I going crazy? Or did something follow us home from that mountain? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. Part of me doesn't want to know the truth. All I know is that I'll never forget the terror of that night and the impossible encounter that defies all logic. I used to love hiking and camping. Now, the thought of sleeping in a tent makes my skin crawl. Some experiences change you forever, and this is one I'll be grappling with for a long time to come. never thought I'd be the new kid in school, but there I was, 15 years old, and starting over in a small town I'd never even heard of before my dad got transferred. The first day was exactly as awful as I'd imagined. Awkward introductions in every class, eating lunch alone, and feeling like every eye was on me as I walked down the halls. I tried to keep my head down and just get through it, but by the end of the week, I was desperate to make at least one friend. That's when Jake approached me at my locker and invited me to hang out with his group after school. I was so relieved I didn't even think twice before saying yes. Jake and his friends seemed cool. They knew all the best spots in town to hang out, had a wicked sense of humor, and for the first time since moving here, I felt like I might actually belong. We were chilling behind the bleachers one day when Carl walked by. He was this scrawny kid with glasses who always sat alone at lunch. Jake and the others immediately started in with the insults, calling him a freak and a loser. I didn't join in, but I didn't stop them either. After they left, Carl hung back and warned me to be careful around Jake's group. He said they had a reputation for being cruel, especially to new kids. I brushed him off, figuring he was just jealous or trying to cause drama. What did this loner know anyway? Looking back, I wish I'd listened to Carl. Maybe things would have turned out differently. A few weeks later, Jake told me they had an initiation planned for me to officially join their group. I was excited, thinking it would be some harmless prank or dare. We snuck out that night and headed to the old railroad bridge on the edge of town. There was another new kid there. I think his name was Alex. He'd just started at our school the week before. Jake explained that the initiation was simple. Alex and I just had to walk across the bridge. It didn't seem that bad at first. The bridge was old but still sturdy enough. But as we got to the middle, I realized how high up we were. The creek below looked tiny. My stomach dropped as I imagined falling. I glanced at Alex and could see the fear in his eyes too. We both wanted to turn back, but Jake and the others were egging us on from behind. Suddenly I felt a hard shove on my back. For a heart-stopping moment I thought I was going over, but I managed to grab the railing. Alex wasn't so lucky. I'll never forget the sound of his scream as he fell. It seemed to go on forever before being suddenly cut off by a sickening thud. Everything after that is a blur. Someone yelled to run. I stumbled off the bridge in a daze. I remember throwing up in the bushes and shaking uncontrollably. Jake grabbed my arm, his face pale, and told me we had to get out of there, that it was just an accident, that no one could ever know. I let him pull me along, too shocked to resist. We all swore to keep it secret, to never speak of it again. But I couldn't forget. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Alex falling. I had nightmares for weeks. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I could hear his scream echoing in my room. I withdrew from Jake and the others. I couldn't stand to be around them, knowing what we'd done. But I was too afraid to tell anyone the truth. What if they thought I was involved? What if I got in trouble too? So I suffered in silence. I started skipping school, unable to face my classmates. My grades tanked. My parents were worried, but I couldn't explain. How could I tell them their son was mixed up in something so horrible? It was Carl who finally reached out to me. He found me hiding out behind the school during lunch one day. I expected him to gloat or say, "I told you so." But he just sat down next to me and asked if I was okay. Something in his quiet concern broke through the wall I'd put up. Before I knew it, I was telling him everything. He listened without judgment, only speaking to assure me it wasn't my fault. Carl encouraged me to go to the police, but I was too scared. Instead, he helped me find ways to cope with the guilt and anxiety. He introduced me to meditation and journaling. Slowly, I started to feel human again. Carl and I became close friends after that. He was nothing like Jake's group, kind, genuine, always there when I needed him. I realized how wrong I'd been to dismiss him before. Years have passed, but I still think about that night on the bridge, about Alex, whose life was cut tragically short, about how easily I could have met the same fate, about the cruelty humans are capable of, even at a young age. I've thought about coming forward with the truth many times, but fear and shame always hold me back. Jake and the others have all moved away. Would anyone even believe me now? Sometimes I see news stories about similar tragedies, hazing gone wrong, bullying taken too far. It makes me sick knowing it's still happening. I want to scream at those kids to stop, to think about the consequences. But I know they probably wouldn't listen, just like I didn't listen to Carl's warning. I still live in this town. I see the old railroad bridge sometimes when I drive past. A chill goes through me every time. I wonder if Alex's ghost haunts that spot, if he knows how sorry I am, if he'd forgive me for not speaking up. Carl says I need to forgive myself, that holding on to the guilt isn't helping anyone. He's probably right. He usually is. But it's hard to let go of something that changed the course of your life so dramatically. I often wonder how things might have been different if I'd made other choices, if I'd rejected Jake's invitation that first day, if I'd befriended Carl instead, if I'd refused to go to the bridge that night, if I'd had the courage to tell the truth afterward. But I can't change the past. All I can do is try to be a better person going forward, to stand up against cruelty when I see it, to be kind to the outcasts and loners, to value true friendship over shallow popularity. I'm sharing this story now as a warning. To any kids out there feeling pressured to fit in or do something that feels wrong, trust your instincts. Don't be afraid to walk away. Real friends won't put you in danger or make you compromise your values. And to the loners and outcasts, stay true to yourself. Your kindness and integrity are worth more than any clique's approval. You might just end up being someone's lifeline when they need it most. I'll always regret not listening to Carl sooner, but I'm grateful for his friendship in the years since. He showed me that it's never too late to change course and surround yourself with people who bring out the best in you. I may never fully shake the memories of that night on the bridge, but I'm learning to live with them, to use them as motivation to be a force for good in the world, to honor Alex's memory by standing up against the type of cruelty that took his life. If you're out there struggling with guilt or trauma from your past, know that you're not alone. It's never too late to reach out for help, to make amends, to choose a different path. One decision, one moment, can change everything. Choose wisely. It was supposed to be just another ordinary summer in our small town in western New York. My son Jake was 8 years old at the time, and he spent most of his days playing with his best friend, Tommy. They were inseparable, always running around the neighborhood, riding bikes, and coming up with elaborate imaginary games and adventures. I remember that particular day started like any other. Jake wolfed down his breakfast, eager to head out and meet Tommy. Before he left, he mentioned something about a special mission they had planned. I didn't think much of it at the time. The boys were always cooking up some new game or story. As Jake was about to run out the door, something made me pause. Maybe it was the excited glint in his eye, or just some inexplicable parental instinct, but I felt compelled to ask more about their plans. "Where are you guys playing today?" I asked casually. Jake hesitated for just a second before answering. "Oh, just around. maybe by the lake. Something in his tone made me uneasy. The lake was a bit far for them to go alone, and they knew they weren't supposed to play there without an adult. But before I could question him further, he was out the door with a quick, "Bye, Dad." I tried to shake off my concern and focus on some work around the house. But as the morning wore on, I couldn't stop thinking about Jake and Tommy. The uneasy feeling in my gut just kept growing. By early afternoon, I couldn't stand it anymore. I decided to take a walk down to the lake just to check on them. I told myself I was being overprotective, that they were probably fine. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As I approached the lake, the silence hit me first. It was too quiet for a summer afternoon. No splashing, no kids' laughter, nothing. I called out for Jake and Tommy, my voice echoing across the still water. No response. My heart started racing as I scanned the shoreline. That's when I spotted it, Tommy's red bicycle, partially hidden in some bushes near the water's edge. Why would they hide the bike? I rushed over, calling their names more urgently now. As I pushed aside the branches, I felt my blood run cold. Tommy's backpack was there too, along with his shoes neatly placed beside the bike, but there was no sign of Tommy or Jake. Panic set in as I ran along the shore, frantically searching and shouting for the boys. I waded into the water, terrified I'd find them drowned. But there was nothing. They had vanished into thin air. I don't really remember how I got back to town or when exactly I called the police. The next few hours were a blur of flashing lights, search parties, and endless questions. Jake turned up at home a couple hours later, scared and confused. He said Tommy had told him to wait by an old tree while he went to retrieve a special treasure from the lake. Jake waited for what felt like hours, but Tommy never came back. The police searched for days. They dragged the lake, brought in dogs, interviewed everyone in town, but they never found a single trace of Tommy. It was like he'd been swallowed up by the earth. In the weeks that followed, our little town was transformed. Parents wouldn't let their kids out of their sight. There were whispers of kidnapping, of some sinister predator lurking in our midst. But deep down, I think we all felt that this was something else, something we couldn't explain or understand. Jake was never the same after that day. He became withdrawn, plagued by nightmares. He would wake up screaming, talking about the shadows in the water and begging us not to let them take him too. We took him to therapists, but nothing seemed to help. As for me, I was consumed by guilt. Why didn't I go with them that day? Why didn't I ask more questions? The what-ifs ate away at me, destroying my marriage and my mental health. We couldn't bear to stay in that town, surrounded by painful memories and accusing glances. So we moved away, trying to outrun the ghosts of that summer day. But they followed us, as I knew they would. It's been years now, and I still lie awake at night, replaying every moment of that day in my mind. I've read every missing persons report, followed up on every lead, no matter how far-fetched. But there's never been a single clue about what happened to Tommy. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if it really happened at all. If somehow this is all some elaborate nightmare I can't wake up from. But then I look at Jake, at the haunted look that never quite leaves his eyes, and I know it was all too real. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, I'm not sure I believe it myself most days. How can a child simply vanish without a trace? But I know what I saw, or rather, what I didn't see. And I know that somewhere out there, Tommy's parents are still waiting for answers that will never come. I've tried to move on, to build a new life, but a part of me will always be stuck on that lake shore, calling out for two boys who are lost forever. And in the back of my mind, I'll always be wondering, What if it had been Jake instead of Tommy? What if next time it is? So I guess that's why I'm sharing this now. As a warning, maybe. Or just to finally let out the story that's been eating me alive for so long. To all the parents out there, hold your children close and never, ever take your eyes off them, because sometimes they disappear in the blink of an eye, leaving nothing but questions and a lifetime of regret. I never thought I'd find myself in the middle of a counterterrorism operation, but that's exactly what happened to me last Tuesday. It was just a normal day. I had gotten home from work and was relaxing in my flat in Manchester, scrolling through my phone and thinking about what to make for dinner. Around 7 p.m., I decided to step out into the small back garden to get some fresh air. As soon as I stepped outside, I nearly jumped out of my skin. There was a man crouched down by my fence, dressed all in black tactical gear and holding an assault rifle. My heart started racing, and I opened my mouth to yell, but before I could make a sound, the man quickly held up his hand in a quiet gesture. He motioned for me to come closer. My legs felt like jelly as I took a few hesitant steps towards him. Up close, I could see that under his black helmet was the face of a man probably in his 40s, with intense blue eyes. In a low voice he said, "I'm Detective Sergeant Wilson with Counterterrorism. I need your cooperation for an urgent operation. Please remain calm and quiet." I nodded, still in shock. DS Wilson continued in hushed tones. "We have credible intelligence about terrorist suspects in the flat directly above yours. We need to access their apartment immediately, but we can't risk alerting them by coming through the front. I need you to let us in through your flat so we can enter from below." My mind was reeling. Terrorist suspects? In the flat above mine? How was this possible? I'd seen the couple who lived up there a few times in passing. They seemed totally normal. DS Wilson must have sensed my disbelief. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said, "but I assure you this is a sanctioned operation of the utmost importance. We believe these individuals may be connected to the Manchester Arena bombing. We need to move quickly and quietly. Can I count on your assistance?" At the mention of the arena bombing, a chill went through me. That horrific attack was still fresh in everyone's minds. If there was even a chance of stopping something like that from happening again, I knew I had to help. "Oh, okay," I stammered. "What do you need me to do?" DS Wilson nodded approvingly. "Good man. First, I need you to go back inside like everything is normal. Act casual. Don't raise any suspicions. Leave your back door unlocked. In exactly 3 minutes, I'll enter with my team. We'll need you to guide us to the access point for the upstairs flat. Do you know where that is?" I thought for a moment. "There's a hatch in my hallway ceiling that leads to the space between the floors. I think you could get into their flat from there." "Perfect," said DS Wilson. "When we come in, just point us to that hatch and then stay in your living room. Keep the TV on at normal volume to help mask any noise. Do you understand?" I nodded, trying to take it all in. "Remember, act normal. 3 minutes, unlock the door, show us the hatch, then stay put." "Got it?" "Got it," I replied. "All right, go now, and thank you for your service to your country." With that, DS Wilson melted back into the shadows by my fence. I took a deep breath and went back inside, my hands shaking slightly as I slid the door closed behind me. Those next 3 minutes felt like the longest of my life. I paced around my flat, trying to act normal, but feeling anything but. My thoughts were racing. Was I doing the right thing? What if this somehow went wrong? What if the people upstairs realized what was happening? I jumped when I heard the soft click of my back door opening. 4 black-clad figures slipped inside, moving with an eerie silence. D.S. Wilson was in the lead. He gave me a questioning look, and I pointed down the hallway to where the hatch was located. The team moved swiftly to the spot. 2 of them produced some kind of telescoping ladder. Another had tools to quickly and quietly remove the hatch cover. I was impressed by how smoothly and silently they worked. As they prepared to ascend, D.S. Wilson turned to me and whispered, "Remember, stay in the living room. If you hear any commotion, get down on the floor immediately. Understood?" I nodded and retreated to my sofa, heart pounding. I turned on the TV as instructed, flipping to a random sitcom, but I couldn't focus on it at all. My ears were straining to hear any sound from above. For several long minutes, there was nothing, just the laugh track from the TV show. Then suddenly, I heard muffled thumps and crashes from the flat above. There were some shouts that I couldn't make out. I instinctively ducked down behind my sofa, terrified of what might be happening. The commotion continued for what felt like ages, but was probably only a minute or 2. Then silence fell again. I stayed crouched behind the sofa, unsure of what to do. After a few more minutes, I heard footsteps in my hallway. D.S. Wilson appeared in the living room doorway. "You can come out now," he said. "It's over." I shakily got to my feet. What happened? Did you get them?" D.S. Wilson's face was grim. "We've apprehended 2 individuals who will be taken in for questioning. I can't share any more details at this time, but I want to thank you again for your assistance. You've done a great service today." I nodded numbly, still trying to process everything that had just occurred. D.S. Wilson continued, "A team will be by shortly to repair the hatch and any other damage. You'll also be visited by an agent who will debrief you and have you sign some confidentiality agreements. I know this has been a shock, but I need you to keep everything that happened here tonight to yourself. It's a matter of national security. Can you do that?" "Yes, of course," I replied. D.S. Wilson gave me a small smile. "You've been very brave. Try to get some rest now, and remember, not a word to anyone." With that, he and his team slipped out as silently as they had entered. I was left standing alone in my living room, head spinning. True to D.S. Wilson's word, a cleanup crew arrived within the hour to repair the hatch and erase any signs of the operation. Later that evening, a stern-faced woman in a dark suit came by with a stack of papers for me to sign, swearing me to secrecy about the night's events. It's been a week now, and I'm still rattled by what happened. I've caught glimpses of new tenants moving into the flat above. I assume the previous occupants won't be returning. I jump at every unexpected sound. I find myself constantly watching the news, wondering if there will be any mention of foiled terrorist plots. But mostly, I'm haunted by how quickly my normal life was turned upside down. One minute I was deciding what to have for dinner. The next, I was in the middle of a covert counter-terrorism raid. I can't help but wonder how many other seemingly ordinary buildings and people around me might be hiding dark secrets. How many other operations like this might be happening all around us without anyone knowing. I know I can never speak of that night to anyone, but I needed to write it down, to try to process it somehow. If nothing else, it's a reminder that the world can change in an instant, that danger and heroism can be hiding just behind the veil of everyday life, and that sometimes average citizens like me can play a small but crucial role in keeping others safe. I'll never look at my neighbors the same way again. I'll never feel quite as secure in my own home. But I also have a new appreciation for the unseen protectors working tirelessly to keep us all safe. I just hope I never have to assist in an operation like that again. Once was more than enough for this ordinary bloke from Manchester. Still lived in Ipswich when it all happened. It was December 2006, and the whole town was on edge. 5 women had been found dead in less than 2 weeks, all of them sex workers. The fear was palpable. You could see it in people's eyes as they hurried down the streets, constantly looking over their shoulders. I remember the day it really hit me how serious this was. I was walking home from work, taking my usual route through a quiet residential area. The sun had already set, and a chill hung in the air. As I passed by a row of houses, I noticed something odd. Nearly every home had their curtains drawn tight, even though it wasn't that late. It was like the whole neighborhood was trying to hide. That's when I saw her, a young woman standing alone on a street corner, poorly dressed for the cold weather. My heart sank as I realized she was likely one of the local sex workers. Didn't she know how dangerous it was to be out here? I wanted to say something, to warn her, but I just quickened my pace and hurried past. The guilt of not helping has stayed with me ever since. As I neared my flat, a police car crawled slowly down the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The officers inside were scanning the area intently. It should have made me feel safer, but it only amplified my unease. This wasn't the Ipswich I knew anymore. It had become a hunting ground. I spent that night glued to the local news, desperate for any updates. They kept showing the same few photos of the victims, smiling faces that masked the hard lives they'd led. It was surreal to think that just days ago, these women had been walking the same streets as me. Now they were gone, their bodies discarded like trash. The next morning, I woke to find "Killer Still at Large" splashed across the front page of the newspaper. As I read through the article, a chill ran down my spine. The police seemed no closer to catching the murderer. How many more would die before this ended? I tried to go about my day as normal, but it was impossible. At work, it was all anyone could talk about. Theories flew back and forth. Was it a truck driver passing through? A local man with a grudge against sex workers? Some even whispered it could be a cop, someone who knew how to avoid detection. On my lunch break, I overheard 2 colleagues discussing how one of the victims' bodies had been posed. I felt sick to my stomach and had to leave the room. These were real people, not just lurid headlines. I couldn't stop thinking about their families, the grief they must be enduring. As the days wore on, the atmosphere in town grew even more tense. People were staying in after dark, and many businesses were closing early. The streets that were usually bustling with holiday shoppers were eerily quiet. It felt like the whole city was holding its breath, waiting for the next horrible discovery. I started having trouble sleeping. Every noise outside my window made me jolt awake, imagining the worst. Was that a scream in the distance, or just the wind? The shadows in my room seemed to move on their own, playing tricks on my tired eyes. Then came the day that changed everything. I was at work when suddenly everyone's phones started buzzing with news alerts. They'd made an arrest, Steve Wright, a 48-year-old forklift driver. The relief in the office was immediate and overwhelming. People were hugging, some even crying with joy. But as more details emerged, that relief gave way to a creeping horror. Wright had lived in Ipswich for years. He was married, held down a steady job. To all appearances, he was just an ordinary bloke. How could someone like that harbor such evil? I couldn't stop thinking about all the times I might have passed him on the street or stood behind him in line at the shops. Had he been planning his next kill in those moments? The randomness of it all was terrifying. If someone like Wright could be a serial killer, then anyone could be. The trial that followed was a media circus. Every day brought new, gruesome details about the murders. I tried to avoid it, but it was impossible to escape completely. Snippets of testimony would reach me. How he'd picked up the women in his car, strangled them, then dumped their naked bodies in remote areas. What haunted me most was learning about Wright's background. He'd had a troubled childhood, bouncing between divorced parents. As an adult, he'd racked up massive gambling debts and had a history of petty crime. It painted a picture of a man slowly spiraling out of control, his darkness growing over decades until it exploded in violence. When the guilty verdict came down and Wright was sentenced to life in prison, there was a sense of closure for many in Ipswich. But for me, it only left me with more questions. How had no one noticed Wright's descent into madness? Could anything have been done to stop him earlier? It's been years now, but I still think about those weeks of terror often. The fear may have faded, but the sadness lingers. 5 young women lost their lives in the most brutal way imaginable. Their families will never be the same, and neither will Ipswich. Sometimes when I'm walking through town, I'll pass by the areas where Wright picked up his victims. They look so ordinary in the daylight, just quiet streets and corners. But I can never shake the feeling that some trace of that evil still lingers there. I've tried to make sense of it all, to find some lesson or meaning in the tragedy. But the truth is, there are no easy answers. Evil can hide in plain sight. The most ordinary-seeming person can be capable of monstrous acts. It's a hard reality to accept, but one I've had to come to terms with. The Ipswich murders changed me, changed all of us who lived through that time. It opened our eyes to a darkness we never wanted to see. But it also showed the strength of our community, how people came together in the face of terror. We'll never forget those 5 women, or the fear that gripped our town. All we can do now is try to be more aware, more compassionate, and hope that somehow we can prevent such horrors from happening again. But even now, years later, I still find myself glancing over my shoulder when I'm out alone at night. The memory of those dark days lingers, a reminder that safety is never guaranteed. Ipswich may have healed on the surface, but beneath that calm exterior, the scars remain. We're forever changed by the knowledge that evil once walked among us, wearing the face of an ordinary man. I'm Molly, a 23-year-old from Glasgow who had been backpacking through Europe for the past few months. Germany was my final stop before heading home, and I was determined to make the most of it. The city was buzzing with excitement for the football tournament, and I found myself swept up in the festive atmosphere. That night, I decided to join some other travelers from the hostel for drinks at a popular bar near the city center. The place was packed, with fans from all over Europe mingling and cheering. As the night wore on, I found myself chatting with an older gentleman at the bar. He introduced himself as Hans and seemed friendly enough, telling me he was a local who loved meeting visitors and showing them around. When I mentioned it was my last night in Stuttgart, Hans insisted on taking me to his favorite Irish pub nearby. "You can't leave without experiencing a proper pint," he exclaimed. Against my better judgment, I agreed. My new hostel friends were deep in conversation with some German fans, and I figured I'd only be gone for a short while. As we left the bar, I felt a twinge of unease. The streets were quieter now, with most of the revelers having moved indoors. Hans led me down a series of narrow alleys, insisting it was a shortcut. With each turn, my anxiety grew. Something about his demeanor had changed. His friendly smile now seemed more like a sinister grin. "You know, Molly," he said suddenly, his voice taking on a chilling tone, "I've always had a fascination with travelers. They're so trusting." My heart began to race. I tried to keep my voice steady as I replied, "Oh, that's interesting. How much further to the pub?" Hans chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, we're not really going to a pub, my dear. I have something much more exciting planned." I felt my blood run cold. My instincts screamed at me to run, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. Hans continued speaking, his words becoming more disturbing with each passing moment. "You see, I've spent years perfecting my craft. Started small in Germany, of course. But then I branched out. Ireland was particularly fruitful, all those young backpackers so far from home. And don't get me started on Iraq. War zones are a predator's paradise." My mind reeled, trying to process what I was hearing. This kindly old man was confessing to being a serial killer, and I was his next target. I desperately scanned the empty street for any sign of help, but we were alone in the shadows. Hans gripped my arm tightly, his fingers digging into my skin. "You'll make a lovely addition to my collection, Molly. So young, so vibrant. It's almost a shame to snuff out that light." I was on the verge of panic, my breath coming in short gasps. I knew I needed to act, to fight, to run, anything. But terror had paralyzed me. Just then, a miracle happened. A young German man stumbled out of a nearby doorway, clearly intoxicated and singing loudly. Hans immediately loosened his grip on my arm, his demeanor shifting back to the friendly old man act. The drunk man approached us, slurring something in German. Hans replied sharply, trying to wave him off. In that moment of distraction, I saw my chance. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I wrenched my arm free and ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, not daring to look back. I could hear Hans shouting behind me, his voice filled with rage, but I didn't stop. I ran through unfamiliar streets, my only thought to put as much distance between us as possible. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I found myself in a more populated area. Spotting a taxi, I frantically waved it down and jumped in, gasping out the address of my hostel. As the taxi pulled away, I finally allowed myself to break down. The driver, concerned, asked if I needed help, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. How could I possibly describe what had just happened? Back at the hostel, I locked myself in the bathroom and sobbed, my whole body shaking. The realization of how close I'd come to becoming another statistic, another missing traveler, hit me full force. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bunk, jumping at every sound. When morning came, I checked out early and headed straight for the airport, desperate to leave Stuttgart and the horrors it now held for me. Even now, months later, I struggle to make sense of that night. The police were skeptical when I finally worked up the courage to report it, with no evidence beyond my terrified recollection. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if the stress of traveling and the excitement of the Euros somehow warped my perception. But then I remember the cold glint in Hans's eyes as he spoke of his collection, and I know it was all too real. I can't help but think about how many others might have fallen victim to his twisted game. How many families are still searching for loved ones who never returned from their European adventures. I'm sharing this story now as a warning to other travelers. Trust your instincts. Don't be afraid to seem rude or paranoid, and never, ever go off alone with a stranger, no matter how harmless they might seem. I was lucky. That drunk German man unknowingly saved my life that night. But I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, Hans is still hunting, still adding to his horrific collection. And that thought keeps me awake at night, wondering who his next target might be. I was on my way home from work, just another mundane Tuesday evening in New York City. The subway car was packed as usual for rush hour, but I managed to snag a seat near the door. I pulled out my phone, scrolling mindlessly through social media to pass the time. A few stops in, I noticed a man board the train. At first glance, there was nothing particularly remarkable about him. Average height and build, dark hoodie, jeans. But as he moved further into the car, I caught sight of his face, or rather, the mask covering it. It was one of those trendy Nike face masks, but something about the way he wore it seemed off. His eyes darted around wildly above it, bloodshot and unfocused. As the doors closed and we lurched forward, the man stumbled slightly. That's when I first heard it. A muffled sobbing sound coming from behind the mask. My stomach clenched with an inexplicable sense of dread. The crying grew louder, punctuated by ragged gasps for air. Other passengers were starting to take notice now, too. I saw concerned glances being exchanged, people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The man began pacing up and down the aisle, his movements jerky and erratic. Suddenly, he let out an agonized wail that made my blood run cold. "Why? Oh God, why did this have to happen?" he cried out. Several people flinched at the outburst. A woman clutched her purse tighter to her chest. I found myself shrinking back against the window, heart pounding. What the hell was going on with this guy? My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe he'd just gotten some terrible news. Lost a loved one? Or was he on drugs? Mentally ill? Whatever it was, every instinct told me this situation was dangerous and unpredictable. The man's sobs devolved into a string of unintelligible muttering. I strained to make out what he was saying, but could only catch snippets. All my fault. Should have been me. Can't live with this. An elderly gentleman tentatively approached him. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need help?" The masked man whirled around, causing the older man to stumble backwards. "Stay away from me," he snarled. "None of you understand. None of you can possibly understand what I've done." A chill ran down my spine. What had he done? My imagination conjured up horrific scenarios. I found myself eyeing the emergency call button, wondering if I should alert the conductor. The train screeched to a halt at the next station. A handful of people hurriedly exited, clearly eager to escape the tense atmosphere. But as the doors began to close, the disturbed man lunged forward and stuck his arm out, forcing them open again. "Where do you think you're going?" he shouted at the retreating passengers. "Running away won't save you, won't save any of us." He stumbled back into the car, nearly falling as the train started moving again. That's when I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. A dark stain on the sleeve of his hoodie. Was that blood? My palms were sweating now, heart hammering so loud I was sure others could hear it. I wanted desperately to get off this train, to put as much distance between myself and this unhinged stranger as possible. But we were between stations, hurtling through a dark tunnel with no escape. The masked man's ranting grew more frenzied. He paced faster, gesticulating wildly. "It's all connected, don't you see? The signs were there all along. I should have known, should have stopped it. But now it's too late. Too late for all of us." A teenage girl across from me was openly crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. An older woman had her arm around her, murmuring words of comfort. But I could see the fear in her eyes too. I found myself fixated on that stain on his sleeve. Had he hurt someone? Was he capable of hurting us? The subway car suddenly felt claustrophobic, the air thick and suffocating. Without warning, the man rushed to the center of the car and grabbed onto one of the poles. "Listen to me," he bellowed. "All of you. You need to know the truth, need to understand what's coming." He paused, chest heaving with ragged breaths. The entire car was dead silent, all eyes locked fearfully on him. When he spoke again, his voice was chillingly calm. "Tonight," he said softly, "tonight you're all going to feel it, the pain, the fear, the hopelessness, just like I did, just like they did." A woman near me let out a strangled sob. I saw a man further down discreetly dial 911 on his phone. "Who?" someone whispered. "Who are you talking about?" The masked man's eyes locked onto the questioner, and I swear I saw a maniacal gleam in them. "You'll see," he said. "Oh, you'll all see soon enough." The train began to slow as we approached the next station. I've never felt such overwhelming relief in my life. As soon as those doors opened, I was going to run like hell. But the masked man wasn't done. He stumbled towards the doors, blocking the exit. "No one leaves," he growled. "Not until you understand. Not until you feel what I felt." That was it. Panic exploded through the car. People were shouting, crying, pushing to get away from him. I saw a burly man lunge forward, trying to restrain the guy. But he was like a man possessed, thrashing and howling as he fought back. In the chaos, I spotted an opening. Heart in my throat, I made a break for it. I squeezed past the struggling men and burst out onto the platform, gasping for air. Behind me, I could hear screams and the sounds of a scuffle. I ran until my lungs burned, taking the stairs two at a time. I didn't stop until I reached the street, the cool night air hitting my face. Only then did I realize I was shaking uncontrollably. I collapsed onto a nearby bench, struggling to catch my breath. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I'd just experienced. In the distance, I heard sirens approaching. I should stay, I thought, give a statement to the police. But the thought of going back down there, of potentially facing that man again, I couldn't do it. I hailed the first cab I saw and gave the driver my address, my voice trembling. As we pulled away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just narrowly escaped something truly horrific. That night, I obsessively checked the news, half expecting reports of some terrible incident. But there was nothing. No mention of a subway disturbance, no crimes matching what I'd witnessed. It's been weeks now, and I still lie awake at night replaying those terrifying moments. Who was that man? What had happened to him? And what did he mean about everyone feeling it that night? I don't know if I'll ever get answers, but one thing's for certain. I haven't set foot on the subway since, and I'm not sure I ever will again. It all started when I matched with this guy, let's call him Tom, on Tinder. His profile seemed normal enough. 28 years old, software engineer, into hiking and video games. We chatted for a few days and he came across as a bit socially awkward, but otherwise fine. When he asked if I wanted to meet up for coffee, I figured why not. We agreed to meet at this little cafe downtown on Saturday afternoon. I got there a few minutes early and grabbed a table by the window. When Tom walked in, the first thing I noticed was how fidgety and nervous he seemed. He kept glancing around the room and wringing his hands as he approached my table. Hi, I'm Tom, he said, barely making eye contact as he sat down. Sorry if I seem a bit off. I have Asperger's and social situations can be challenging for me. I tried to put him at ease, telling him it was no problem at all. We ordered our coffees and started with some small talk about work and hobbies. Tom gradually seemed to relax a bit, though he still had this intense, hyper-focused way of speaking. Things took a weird turn when I mentioned I had a cat. Tom's eyes lit up, and he launched into this long, detailed monologue about feline anatomy and behavior. It was like a switch had flipped, and suddenly he couldn't stop talking about cats. He went on for a solid 10 minutes, rattling off obscure facts and statistics. I politely tried to change the subject a few times, but he kept circling back to cats. At one point he said, "Did you know that a cat's penis has backward-facing barbs on it? When the male withdraws after mating, it scrapes the walls of the female's vagina to induce ovulation." I nearly choked on my coffee. Who says something like that on a first date? Tom didn't seem to notice my discomfort and just kept rambling about cat genitalia. I was starting to feel really uneasy. Finally, I managed to steer the conversation in a different direction. We chatted a bit about movies and TV shows we liked. Tom mentioned he was a big fan of true crime documentaries. That should have been another red flag, but I didn't think much of it at the time. After about an hour, Tom suggested we go for a walk in the park across the street. I hesitated, not sure if I wanted to prolong this increasingly awkward date. But I also felt a little bad for the guy. He was clearly struggling socially, and I didn't want to be rude. So against my better judgment, I agreed. As we were walking through the park, Tom suddenly blurted out, "I brought my gun with me today. Want to see it?" My heart started racing. You have a gun? Right now?" I stammered. Tom nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, I always carry it for protection. Don't worry, I have a concealed carry permit." He started to reach for his waistband. "No, please don't take it out," I said quickly. "I'm not comfortable around guns." He looked disappointed, but thankfully left it holstered. "Oh, okay. Most girls think it's pretty cool when I show them. My ex-girlfriend loved target shooting with me." I was seriously regretting my decision to extend this date. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there. But I was afraid of how Tom might react if I tried to leave abruptly. So I just nodded and tried to change the subject again. We walked in silence for a few minutes. I was desperately trying to think of an excuse to end the date when Tom spoke up again. "Hey, want to hear a poem I wrote? I'm really proud of it." Before I could respond, he pulled out his phone and started reciting, "Little girl so sweet and pure, your innocence I must procure. Tender flesh and golden hair, I'll take you to my secret lair." I felt like I was going to be sick. Was this some kind of sick joke? But Tom's face was completely serious as he continued, "Screams of pain and tears of fright will be my pleasure through the night. When I'm done, you'll be no more, just a corpse upon the floor." He finished with a proud smile, clearly expecting praise. I was frozen in horror, unable to process what I'd just heard. Why would you write something like that?" I finally managed to choke out. Tom looked confused. "What do you mean? It's just a poem exploring dark themes." I thought the imagery was quite vivid and powerful. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. How could he not see how utterly disturbing and wrong that was? I needed to get away from this guy immediately. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and pretended to check a text. "Oh no, I'm so sorry, but I just got an emergency message from my dad. I have to go right away." Tom's face fell. "Oh, okay. Can we reschedule?" Maybe. I'll text you, I lied. I really have to run now. Bye. I turned and speed-walked away as fast as I could without actually running. I could feel Tom's eyes boring into my back as I left. As soon as I was out of sight, I broke into a run. I didn't stop until I reached my car, parked a few blocks away. I jumped in, locked the doors, and burst into tears. The full weight of how much danger I'd potentially been in came crashing down on me. With trembling fingers, I texted my dad, "Emergency. Please call me ASAP and pretend you need me to come home right away." Less than a minute later, my phone rang. I answered and loudly said, "Hey Dad, what's wrong?" "Okay, I'll be right there." Then I hung up and peeled out of the parking lot. I drove straight home, constantly checking my mirrors to make sure I wasn't being followed. When I got inside, I double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked. Then I sat on my bed and had a full-blown panic attack. Once I'd calmed down a bit, I blocked Tom's number and unmatched him on Tinder. I briefly considered reporting him to the police, but I wasn't sure if he'd actually broken any laws. And to be honest, I was terrified of doing anything that might provoke him to come after me. It's been a week now, and I still have nightmares about Tom. I keep replaying all the red flags I ignored, the inappropriate comments, the gun, that horrific poem. I shudder to think what might have happened if I'd gone anywhere private with him. I know I'm lucky to have gotten away safely, but I can't shake the feeling that Tom is still out there, probably talking to other women on dating apps. I want to warn people, but I'm scared of drawing attention to myself. So I guess I'm sharing this here as a cautionary tale. Please be careful when meeting strangers from the internet. Trust your instincts if something feels off. And never be afraid to leave a situation that makes you uncomfortable, even if it seems rude. Your safety is more important than politeness. I don't think I'll be using dating apps again anytime soon. The whole experience has left me shaken and distrustful. I know not all men are like Tom, but now I can't help wondering what dark secrets might be lurking behind a seemingly normal profile. Sometimes I still feel like I'm being watched. I've started taking different routes to work and always checking over my shoulder. Maybe I'm being paranoid, but after what happened, I don't think I can ever let my guard down again. I had been out celebrating my best friend's birthday at this cute little bar downtown. It was a great night, lots of laughter, maybe a few too many cocktails, but overall, just a fun time with friends. As the night was winding down around 1 a.m., I said my goodbyes and headed to the nearby subway station to catch the train home. The station was pretty deserted at that hour, just a couple other late-night stragglers waiting on the platform. I was feeling a bit woozy from the drinks, but in good spirits as I scrolled through my phone, looking at the photos we'd taken that night. That's when I first noticed him, a guy probably in his 30s, kind of scruffy looking, who kept glancing over at me. At first I tried to ignore it, but I could feel his eyes boring into me. It made me uncomfortable, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. When the train pulled up a few minutes later, I got into the first car, hoping he'd choose a different one. No such luck. He followed me in and sat directly across from me, staring intently. My heart started racing as I realized we were the only two people in the car. I tried to act natural, keeping my eyes glued to my phone. But then he started talking to me, asking if I was having a fun night out. His tone was aggressive, almost mocking. I mumbled a polite response, hoping he'd leave me alone, but he kept going, his voice getting louder. "You think you're so pretty, don't you? Prancing around like that. But I can see what you really are." A chill ran through me as I realized what was happening. He'd clocked me as trans and was gearing up for some kind of hateful tirade. I've dealt with transphobic comments before, but something about his demeanor terrified me. We were alone, I was tipsy, and he seemed unhinged. I stood up, moving towards the door connecting to the next car. "Please leave me alone," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice from shaking. He jumped up too, blocking my path. "Where do you think you're going, freak? I'm not done talking to you yet." Panic flooded through me. I pushed past him and ran into the next car, which was also empty. I could hear him following close behind, shouting slurs and threats. My mind was racing. Should I pull the emergency brake? Try to get to the conductor? I had no idea how many more stops until mine. All I knew was I had to get away from this guy. When we pulled into the next station, I bolted out the doors the second they opened. It was a station I didn't recognize, totally deserted at this hour. I ran up the stairs to street level, gasping for breath, my heels clacking loudly on the concrete. I emerged onto an empty street, disoriented and terrified. Where was I? How far from home? I could hear the guy coming up the stairs behind me, still yelling. Without thinking, I took off running down the street. My legs were shaking, my lungs burning as I sprinted in my party dress and heels. I could hear his footsteps pounding the pavement behind me. How long could I keep this up? I turned down a side street, praying to find someone, anyone, who could help. But it was deserted. Tears were streaming down my face as I ran, my makeup smearing. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a 24-hour convenience store up ahead, its fluorescent lights a beacon of hope. I burst through the doors, startling the sleepy-looking cashier. "Please help me," I gasped out between sobs. "There's a man chasing me. He won't leave me alone." The cashier, a middle-aged woman, looked alarmed. "Oh, honey, are you okay? Come back here behind the counter with me." I stumbled behind the counter, collapsing onto a stool as my legs gave out. The woman locked the front door and called 911. A few minutes later, I saw my pursuer walk by the store, peering in the windows. I shrank down, praying he wouldn't spot me. The cashier saw him too and described him to the 911 operator. It felt like an eternity before 2 police officers showed up. By then, the guy was long gone. I gave my statement, still shaking. But I could tell the officers weren't taking it very seriously. One of them even had the nerve to ask if I'd been leading the guy on somehow. I was too exhausted and traumatized to argue. They said they'd keep an eye out, but there wasn't much they could do. I knew they wouldn't follow up. The kind cashier offered to call me a cab, but I was too scared to get in a car with a stranger. Instead, I called my mom in tears, begging her to come get me even though it was the middle of the night. My poor mom. I'll never forget the look of fear and worry on her face when she pulled up 30 minutes later. I collapsed into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. She helped me into the car and drove me home, murmuring soothing words the whole way. I spent the next week barely able to leave my apartment. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's hateful face, heard his cruel words. I jumped at every sound, convinced he'd somehow found me. It's been a few months now, and I'm doing better with the help of therapy. But I still get panicky in crowded places or on public transit. I'm hypervigilant, always scanning for potential threats. That night shattered my sense of safety in a way I'm not sure will ever fully heal. It was a stark reminder of the dangers trans women like me face just for existing. I'm sharing this story not for sympathy, but in the hope that it might open some eyes to the reality of what we go through. To anyone who's experienced something similar, you're not alone. And to those who haven't, please be an ally. Speak up when you see harassment happening. You never know when your voice might save someone from the terror I endured that night. I'm still processing everything that happened, still trying to make sense of it. Some days are harder than others, but I'm determined not to let that man's hatred define me or hold me back. I am who I am, and I deserve to exist in this world without fear. We all do. We had just moved from Berlin to a small town in Bavaria. The house was old but charming, with lots of character. My parents fell in love with it instantly. I was less enthused. Something about the place gave me an uneasy feeling from day one. But I tried to stay positive for my family's sake. The first few nights were quiet enough. But on the fourth night, I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m. At first I wasn't sure what had disturbed my sleep. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere below. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. There it was again, a slow, deliberate scraping noise. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the old wooden storage area connected to our basement. My heart started racing. Was someone down there? A burglar, maybe? Or some kind of animal that had gotten in? I debated waking my parents, but I didn't want to seem paranoid over what could just be the house settling. So I forced myself to try to go back to sleep, though it took hours before I finally drifted off. The next morning at breakfast, I casually asked if anyone else had heard any weird noises in the night. My parents and sister all shook their heads, looking at me quizzically. "Must have just been a dream," my mom said with a reassuring smile. I nodded and tried to put it out of my mind. But that night, I heard the sounds again. This time they were louder and more distinct, not just scratching, but also a dull thumping, almost like footsteps. Again, no one else seemed to hear anything. Over the next few days, the nightly noises continued and intensified. Sometimes it sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Other times like someone rifling through papers or boxes. I became more and more on edge. I had trouble sleeping and started feeling jumpy during the day. Dark circles formed under my eyes. My family noticed the change in my demeanor and kept asking if I was feeling all right. Finally, after nearly a week of this, I broke down and told my parents everything. They listened with concerned expressions, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. "Honey, old houses make all kinds of strange noises," my dad said gently. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about," but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. That night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I set up my phone to record video of the basement storage area overnight. The next morning, I anxiously retrieved my phone and started watching the footage. For the first couple hours, nothing happened. But then, around 2:30 a.m., I saw a shadow move across the frame. My blood ran cold. I rewound and watched it again in slow motion. There was no mistaking it. A human-shaped silhouette had definitely crossed in front of the camera. With shaking hands, I kept watching. A few minutes later, I heard the scratching noises start up. The camera was pointed at some old shelving units full of boxes and junk. As I watched in horror, one of the boxes started to move, seemingly on its own. It slid off the shelf and hit the floor with a thud. Then the lid of the box slowly opened. I leaned in closer, heart pounding, desperate to see what was inside. But the angle was wrong. All I could make out was a pale, bony hand reaching out of the box. I slammed my laptop shut, feeling like I was going to be sick. This was so much worse than I had imagined. Someone, or something, was living in our basement. I ran to show my parents the video, but when I tried to pull it up again, the file was corrupted. No matter what I did, I couldn't get it to play. They clearly thought I was losing my mind. That night, I barricaded myself in my room, pushing my dresser in front of the door. I lay awake all night, terrified of what might come creeping up the stairs. The noises were worse than ever, not just scratching now, but banging and crashing. At one point I swear I heard whispering voices, though I couldn't make out any words. Around dawn, everything finally went quiet. I must have dozed off for a bit, because the next thing I knew, my mom was knocking on my door, asking why it was blocked. I moved the dresser and let her in. She gasped when she saw the state of my room. I had torn it apart, looking for something to use as a weapon if needed. Clothes and books were strewn everywhere. The contents of my desk drawers were dumped on the floor. My bed sheets were twisted and knotted from my fitful tossing and turning. "What on earth happened in here?" my mom asked, looking alarmed. I tried to explain again about the noises, the video, how sure I was that someone was living in our basement. But I could see in her eyes that she thought I was having some kind of breakdown. She insisted I stay home from school that day and rest. My dad called a doctor to come check on me. I overheard them talking in low, worried voices about stress and possible hallucinations. I felt utterly defeated. No one believed me, and I was starting to doubt my own sanity. Had I imagined it all? But it had felt so real. That afternoon, while my parents were talking to the doctor in the living room, I snuck down to the basement one last time. I had to know for sure. The storage area was dim and musty. Dust motes floated in the weak sunlight filtering through a grimy window. Everything looked normal at first glance, but then I noticed something odd. One of the big cardboard boxes on the bottom shelf was slightly askew, its lid partially open. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid the rest of the way. The box was empty, but there were scratch marks on the inside, as if something had clawed its way out. And in the corner was a small scrap of paper. I unfolded it with shaking fingers. In messy handwriting were just 3 words, "I see you." I dropped the paper and ran out of there as fast as I could. I begged my parents to let us move, to call the police, to do something. But they were convinced I was having a mental health crisis. They increased my therapy sessions and put me on medication. The nightly noises stopped, or at least I stopped hearing them. Maybe the pills dulled my senses, or maybe whatever had been down there moved on once it realized I was onto it. It's been 2 years now since we moved into that house. Sometimes I can almost convince myself it was all in my head. But then I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, or wake up with that feeling of being watched. And I know deep down we're not alone in this house. I don't know what's living in our basement. I don't know what it wants or why it's here. All I know is that it's patient, and it's waiting. One of these nights, I'm afraid I'll wake up and find it standing over my bed. And then, well, I try not to think about what might happen then. So that's my story. I know it sounds crazy. Hell, even I'm not sure I believe it sometimes. But I swear it's all true. If you've ever experienced anything similar, please let me know. Sometimes I feel like I'm going insane. I just need to know I'm not alone in this. When the car pulled up, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The driver was a middle-aged man who barely glanced at us as we climbed into the back seat. I noticed his name was Mike, according to the app. He didn't say much beyond confirming our destination, which was fine by me. Jess and I were too busy gossiping and taking selfies to pay him much attention. About 10 minutes into the ride, I started to get an uneasy feeling. Mike kept glancing at us in the rearview mirror with an odd expression. His knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But then I noticed how erratically he was driving, speeding up, slowing down suddenly, weaving between lanes. My heart nearly stopped when another car honked at us after Mike cut them off. He slammed on the brakes and started cursing loudly. "You want to go, asshole?" he yelled out the window. The other driver flipped him off as they sped past. Mike's reaction sent chills down my spine. His face contorted with rage as he pounded the steering wheel. "I'll fucking kill you," he screamed. Jessica and I exchanged terrified glances. This guy was clearly unhinged. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, Mike suddenly pulled over onto the shoulder of the highway. My blood ran cold as I watched him reach into the glove box and pull out a gun. It looked like some kind of old revolver. What are you doing?" I managed to stammer out. Mike turned to face us, his eyes wild. "Teaching that punk a lesson," he snarled. "Nobody disrespects me like that." I felt Jessica grab my hand, squeezing it painfully tight. We were both frozen in fear, unsure what to do. Should we try to run? Call for help? But we were stuck on the side of a busy highway with a clearly unstable man holding a gun. "Please," Jessica said in a shaky voice. "We don't want any trouble. Can you just take us to our destination?" Mike's eyes narrowed as he stared at us. "You two scared?" he asked with a twisted smirk. "Don't worry, I ain't gonna hurt you. Not unless you give me a reason to." He waved the gun casually as he spoke, making my heart race even faster. "This baby's just for protection. You wouldn't believe the crazies I've had to deal with driving for Uber, but I know how to handle 'em." A chill ran through me as he continued. "Had one guy try to rob me last month. Bet he wasn't expecting me to be packing heat." Mike chuckled darkly. "Let's just say he won't be trying that again." I felt sick to my stomach. Was he implying he had killed someone? Jessica must have had the same thought because I heard her breath catch. That's awful," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm so sorry that happened to you, but we really should get going. We don't want to be late." Mike stared at us for what felt like an eternity before finally nodding. "Yeah, all right. Guess we better get you ladies to your party." He tucked the gun into his waistband before pulling back onto the highway. The rest of the ride was agonizing. Jessica and I sat in terrified silence, too afraid to even look at each other. I kept my eyes glued to the GPS on my phone, watching the minutes tick by painfully slowly. Every time Mike made a sudden movement or muttered something under his breath, I flinched. When we finally reached our destination, I nearly cried with relief. As we hurried out of the car, Mike called after us. "You two have a good night now, and remember, be careful out there. Lots of dangerous people in this city." The moment he drove away, Jessica and I collapsed into each other's arms, shaking. "Oh my God," she kept repeating. "Oh my God." We ended up canceling our plans and going straight home. I couldn't stop replaying the horrifying encounter in my mind. The image of Mike waving that gun around was seared into my brain. The next day, we reported the incident to Uber and the police, but without hard evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Mike's account was suspended, but who knows if he's still out there driving for other rideshare apps. It's been months, but I still have nightmares about that night. I haven't been able to bring myself to use Uber since then. The thought of getting into a stranger's car now fills me with paralyzing anxiety. I keep wondering what would have happened if we had said the wrong thing or if that other driver had escalated the confrontation. Would Mike have actually used that gun? The what-ifs haunt me. I know I'm lucky that things didn't turn out worse, but the experience shattered my sense of safety and trust. I'm constantly on edge now, seeing potential threats everywhere. Looking back, there were so many red flags I should have noticed. Mike's erratic driving, his aggressive behavior, the way he kept glancing at us. But in the moment, I froze. I was too scared to take action. I've replayed that night over and over, thinking of all the things I should have done differently. Why didn't I end the ride as soon as I felt uncomfortable? Why didn't I call 911 the moment he pulled out the gun? But I know that fear can paralyze you. When you're in a situation like that, rational thinking goes out the window. All you can focus on is survival. I'm sharing this story as a warning to others. Trust your instincts. If something feels off about your driver, don't ignore that feeling. It's better to be safe than sorry. I've started taking self-defense classes and learning about personal safety. I carry pepper spray with me everywhere now. It helps me feel a little more in control. But I know the trauma of that night will stay with me for a long time. Every time I see a car that looks like Mike's, my heart starts racing. Loud noises make me jump. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. I try to remind myself that most people aren't like Mike, that this was a rare, terrifying incident. But it's hard to shake the feeling that danger could be lurking around any corner. I'm working with a therapist to process the trauma and anxiety. Slowly but surely, I'm trying to reclaim my life and not let fear control me. But I know I'll never take my safety for granted again. To anyone reading this who's been through something similar, you're not alone. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to need help. Reaching out for support doesn't make you weak. And to those who haven't experienced anything like this, please be vigilant. Trust your gut. Have a safety plan. Look out for your friends. You never know when a normal situation could turn dangerous in an instant. I hope sharing my story helps someone else stay safe. No one should have to go through what Jessica and I did that night. The world can be a scary place, but we have to keep living our lives. We just have to be smart and prepared. I still have a long way to go in my healing journey. Some days are harder than others, but I'm determined not to let one terrifying night define the rest of my life. I'm stronger than my fear, and I know that one day I'll be able to get in a car again without panicking. Until then, I'll keep speaking out and sharing my story, because if it helps even one person avoid a similar situation, then something good will have come from that awful night. Stay safe out there, everyone. And remember, trust your instincts. They just might save your life. Remember that day like it was yesterday. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon in late October. The leaves were turning and there was a chill in the air. My husband Tom was out in the barn tinkering with his old pickup truck, and I was inside baking cookies with our 8-year-old daughter Lily. Our farmhouse is pretty isolated. The nearest neighbor is about a mile down the road. We like our privacy out here in the country. I had just put a batch of chocolate chip cookies in the oven when I realized we were out of milk. I told Lily I was going to run to the corner store real quick to grab some. She begged to come with me, but I told her to stay and keep an eye on the cookies. I figured I'd only be gone 15-20 minutes tops. As I was heading out the door, I reminded Lily of the usual rules. Don't answer the door for anyone. Don't use the stove. Call Dad on the walkie-talkie if she needed anything. She nodded impatiently, already eyeing the timer on the oven. I gave her a quick kiss on the head and headed out. The drive to the store was uneventful. I picked up the milk, chatted briefly with Mrs. Johnson, who runs the place, and headed back home. As I turned down our long gravel driveway, I immediately sensed something was off. There was a big black pickup truck I didn't recognize parked near the house. My stomach dropped. I pulled up quickly and jumped out of the car, leaving the milk on the seat. As I rushed towards the house, I saw two men I didn't know standing on our front porch. One was talking to Lily through the screen door. My heart was pounding as I called out, "Lily, go inside right now." The men turned towards me as I approached. They were both tall and burly, dressed in camo hunting gear. The one closest to me spoke first. "Afternoon, Mom. We were just talking to your little girl here about maybe doing some hunting on your land." I positioned myself between them and the door, trying to hide how shaken up I was. "I'm sorry, but we don't allow hunting on our property. You'll need to leave." The second man chimed in. "Now hold on a minute. We're willing to pay good money for the privilege. Why don't we talk to your husband about it?" Just then, Tom came around from the back of the house, clearly alerted by the commotion. "What's going on here?" he asked, eyeing the strangers warily. The first man turned to him with an oily smile. "Ah, you must be the man of the house. We were just discussing the possibility of doing some hunting on your land here. We've got a whole arsenal of weapons with us, rifles, shotguns, you name it. We're happy to pay whatever you think is fair." Tom and I exchanged a look. Something about this felt very wrong. These men didn't seem like typical hunters, and their story kept changing. First, they were just asking Lily about us. Now they wanted to hunt, and why mention all the weapons? Tom spoke firmly. "Like my wife said, we don't allow hunting here. I'm going to have to ask you to leave now." The men's demeanor shifted instantly. The smiles vanished and were replaced with cold stares. The first one said in a low voice, "You sure about that, friend? Might want to reconsider. We can make it worth your while, or make things difficult if you prefer." I felt a chill run down my spine at the thinly veiled threat. Tom stepped closer to me and said evenly, "I won't tell you again. Get off my property now or I'm calling the sheriff." For a tense moment, I thought they might refuse to leave, but then the second man shrugged and said, "All right, have it your way. Let's go, Bill." They turned and walked back to their truck. As they drove off, I noticed there was no license plate on the back. We hurried inside and locked all the doors. Lily was crying, scared by the confrontation. She told us the men had asked her lots of questions about when we'd be home and if we had any guns in the house. I felt sick thinking about what might have happened if I'd been gone just a few minutes longer. We called the sheriff, but by the time a deputy came out to take our statement, the men were long gone. They told us to call again if we saw the truck, but I knew we'd probably never see them again. At least I hoped we wouldn't. That night, we slept fitfully. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf outside had us on edge. I kept imagining that black truck coming back in the dead of night. Tom got up several times to check the locks and peer out the windows. The next morning, I went out to get the newspaper from the end of the driveway like I always do. As I bent down to pick it up, something caught my eye. There, stuck in the grass, was a single rifle shell. My blood ran cold as I picked it up with shaking hands. It wasn't just any shell. It had been carved with strange symbols I didn't recognize. I ran back to the house and showed Tom. He turned it over in his hands, his face grim. "I don't like this one bit," he muttered. We debated calling the sheriff again, but what could we tell them? That we found a shell with some weird markings. It didn't seem like enough to warrant sending someone out. As the days passed, we tried to go back to normal, but there was an undercurrent of tension that wouldn't go away. We installed security cameras and got a big dog. Tom started carrying his pistol when he went out to work in the fields. I wouldn't let Lily play outside alone anymore, but nothing else happened. No sign of the men or the black truck. No more shells or other strange occurrences. Eventually, the edge of our fear started to dull. We found ourselves relaxing bit by bit, convincing ourselves it had just been a one-off encounter with some creepy guys. Then, about a month after the incident, I was home alone one afternoon while Tom took Lily to her dance class in town. I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard the distinct crunch of tires on our gravel driveway. My heart leapt into my throat as I peered out the window. There, pulling up to our house, was a shiny black pickup truck. I froze, my mind racing. Should I call Tom, the police, grab a weapon? As I stood there paralyzed with indecision, 2 men got out of the truck. But they weren't the same men from before. These guys were younger, clean-cut, wearing suits instead of hunting gear. They walked up to the front door and knocked politely. Cautiously, I cracked open the door, leaving the chain on. "Can I help you?" The men smiled warmly. One held up a badge. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Agent Cooper, and this is Agent Mills. We're with the FBI. We'd like to ask you a few questions about an incident that occurred here last month involving 2 unidentified men in a black truck. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Finally, someone was looking into this. I invited them in and told them everything that had happened. They listened intently, taking notes. When I showed them the shell with the strange markings, their eyes widened. "Ma'am, this is very important evidence. Do you mind if we take this with us?" Agent Cooper asked. I readily agreed, just glad to have it out of my house. They asked a few more questions, then thanked me for my time and left. As I watched them drive away, I felt like a weight had been lifted. Whatever was going on, the FBI was on the case now. We were going to be okay. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, a horrible realization hit me. The FBI agents, they had arrived in a black pickup truck, just like the men who had threatened us. And I had invited them into my home, told them everything, even given them the shell, our only piece of evidence. I ran to tell Tom, and we spent a sleepless night debating what to do. Call the real FBI, the local police. In the end, we decided there was nothing we could do. We had no proof that the men weren't really agents, and if they were imposters, what could their purpose possibly be? Why go to all that trouble? It's been years now, and we've never seen the black truck again. No more strange men have shown up at our door, but I still find myself looking over my shoulder sometimes, wondering if we're really safe. And every now and then, I could swear I hear the faint sound of tires on gravel, even when there's no one there. I still remember that day like it was yesterday. It was supposed to be a fun family lunch at McDonald's. Just me, my husband Tom, and my 2 stepdaughters Emily, 11, and Zoe, 8. We don't get to go out together that often, so I was really looking forward to it. If only I'd known how terribly wrong things would go. We arrived at the McDonald's around noon. It was pretty busy, lots of families and kids running around. We managed to snag a booth near the back, which I was grateful for. It's easier to keep an eye on the girls that way. Tom went to order our food while I sat with Emily and Zoe. They were chattering away excitedly about what toys they hoped to get in their Happy Meals. I noticed an older woman sitting alone at a nearby table. She kept glancing over at us, which made me a bit uneasy. But I tried to brush it off. Lots of people watch in restaurants, right? But there was something off about the way she was staring. Her eyes were too wide, too intense. I found myself instinctively shifting to block her view of the girls. Tom came back with our food and we all dug in, the earlier uneasiness fading as we enjoyed our meal together. Emily was telling us about a science project she was working on at school, gesturing animatedly with a French fry. Zoe giggled as she tried to build a tower out of her chicken nuggets. For a little while, everything felt normal and happy. Then I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. The woman who had been staring earlier was suddenly standing right next to our table. Up close, she looked even more unsettling. Her gray hair was disheveled, her clothes rumpled and stained. But it was her eyes that really got to me. They were fixed on Emily with an eerie, hungry intensity that made my skin crawl. "What pretty little girls," she said in a raspy voice. "How old are they?" I tensed up immediately. Every instinct was screaming at me that something was very, very wrong here. Tom must have sensed it too, because he shifted closer to the girls protectively. "That's really none of your business," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Please leave us alone." But she ignored me completely, still staring at Emily. "You must be about 11, right, sweetheart?" she asked, reaching out as if to touch Emily's hair. I grabbed her wrist before she could make contact. "Do not touch my daughter," I hissed. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The woman's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "She's not your real daughter, though, is she? I can tell." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'll give you $5,000 for her. Cash. Right now." For a moment, I couldn't even process what she'd said. It was so horrific, so beyond anything I could have imagined, that my brain just short-circuited. Then the reality of it hit me like a punch to the gut. This deranged woman was trying to buy my stepdaughter, to do God knows what to her. I saw red. All the fear and shock transmuted instantly into white-hot rage. I shoved the woman back forcefully, sending her stumbling into a nearby table. "Get the fuck away from my family, you sick bitch," I screamed. "I'll kill you if you come near these girls again." The entire restaurant went dead silent. Everyone was staring at us. The girls looked terrified, clinging to Tom. The woman righted herself, glaring at me with pure hatred. "You'll regret this," she snarled. "I always get what I want in the end." Then she turned and hurried out of the restaurant before anyone could stop her. As soon as she was gone, I collapsed back into the booth, shaking uncontrollably. Tom wrapped his arms around me and the girls, holding us all close. "It's okay," he murmured. "She's gone. We're safe." But I didn't feel safe. I felt violated, horrified, and scared out of my mind. How many other predators were out there, watching, waiting for a chance to snatch a child? The thought made me want to throw up. Several employees and other patrons came over to check on us. Someone had called the police, thank God. We gave our statements, described the woman as best we could. But I knew the chances of them actually catching her were slim. I insisted we go straight home after that. I needed to get the girls somewhere I knew was secure. The whole way back, I kept checking the rearview mirror, paranoid that we were being followed. Once we got home, I did a thorough check of all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked up tight. Tom gently suggested that maybe I was being a bit paranoid, but I didn't care. All I could think about was keeping my family safe. That night, after the girls were finally asleep, I broke down sobbing in Tom's arms. The full weight of what had almost happened hit me all at once. If I hadn't been there, if I'd let my guard down for even a moment, I couldn't bear to finish the thought. "I can't lose them," I choked out between sobs. "I know I'm not their real mom, but I love them so much. I'd die to protect them." Tom held me tighter. "You are their real mom," he said fiercely. "Biology doesn't matter. You proved that today. They're safe because of you." His words helped a little, but I still felt raw and shaken. I barely slept that night, getting up every hour to check on the girls. Part of me was terrified that if I closed my eyes, that woman would somehow materialize and snatch them away. The next few weeks were rough. I was jumpy and on edge constantly. I didn't want the girls going anywhere without me. School drop-offs and pickups became an anxiety-inducing ordeal. I'd scan the crowd obsessively, looking for that woman's face. Emily and Zoe picked up on my stress, becoming clingy and having nightmares. We all started seeing a family therapist to work through the trauma. Slowly, things got a little better. The constant fear faded to a dull background anxiety. We were able to go out in public again without me having a panic attack. But I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe the way I did before. That day at McDonald's changed me forever. I realized just how quickly your whole world can be turned upside down, how evil can intrude on even the most ordinary moments. But it also showed me the fierce, primal strength of a mother's love, stepmother or not. I would do absolutely anything to keep my girls safe, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure nothing like that ever happens to them again. Sometimes I still see that woman's face in my nightmares, those hungry, predatory eyes fixed on my sweet Emily. I wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing. In those moments, all I can do is go check on the girls, watch their peaceful, sleeping faces, and remind myself that they're safe. We made it through that horrible day. We're survivors. But I'll never stop wondering how many other predators are out there, hiding in plain sight. How many children aren't as lucky as Emily and Zoe were? The thought keeps me up at night. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly at peace again. All I can do is hold my family close, be vigilant, and pray that nothing like that ever happens to us, or anyone else, ever again. It was around 11 p.m., and I was driving back home after visiting my sister who lives in the next town over. The route takes me through some pretty isolated rural roads, you know, the kind with nothing but dark fields and forests on either side for miles. I usually don't mind the drive, but there had been reports of car break-ins and home invasions in the area recently, so I was feeling a bit on edge. I had the radio on low, trying to stay alert as I navigated the winding country roads. The headlights only illuminated a small stretch of asphalt ahead, with pitch blackness beyond. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see another car's headlights appear behind me, but there was nothing. About halfway through my drive, I came around a sharp bend, and suddenly my heart nearly stopped. There, right in the middle of the road, was an enormous figure. My headlights caught the glint of eyes beneath a black hood for just a split second before I instinctively swerved. I'm not exaggerating when I say this guy was massive. He had to be at least 6'5" and built like a linebacker. As I yanked the steering wheel, I caught a glimpse of his arm reaching out towards my car. I could have sworn his hand was unnaturally large, with long fingers stretching towards me. Somehow, I managed to keep control of the car as I swerved around him, tires screeching. I was certain I was about to crash into the ditch, but muscle memory from years of driving took over, and I straightened out. My hands were clenched so tight on the steering wheel that my knuckles were white. As soon as I was past him, I floored it. My little sedan's engine whined in protest as I pushed it to go faster than it was meant to. I was gasping for air, feeling like I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing. Who was that guy? Why was he just standing in the middle of the road like that? Was he trying to make me crash? Or was he hoping I'd stop so he could carjack me or worse? I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, terrified I'd see headlights gaining on me, or that hulking figure somehow keeping pace with my car. But there was nothing behind me but empty road, swallowed up by darkness. After a couple minutes of speeding down the road in panic, I started to calm down just slightly. My breathing was still quick and shallow, but I was able to think a little more clearly. I realized I should probably call the police to report the incident. I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands, keeping my eyes glued to the road ahead. Just as I was about to dial 911, movement caught my eye, and I looked up. My blood ran cold. There, about 50 feet ahead of me, was the same massive hooded figure, standing in the center of the road with his arms outstretched. I screamed and slammed on the brakes, my tires squealing as I skidded towards him. There's no way he could have gotten ahead of me. I'd been driving way too fast. It was impossible. Yet there he was. At the last second, just before I was about to hit him, he vanished, just completely disappeared into thin air. I sat there, engine idling, staring at the empty road in disbelief. Tears were streaming down my face and I was trembling uncontrollably. I don't know how long I sat there frozen in shock. Eventually, I shakily put the car back in drive and continued on, going well below the speed limit and jumping at every shadow. I kept expecting him to appear again, but the rest of the drive was mercifully uneventful. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, unable to bring myself to get out. I was terrified that if I opened the door, that figure would be standing there waiting for me. Eventually, I sprinted from the car to my front door, fumbling with my keys before locking myself inside. I spent the night huddled on my couch with all the lights on, unable to sleep. I've been replaying the incident over and over, trying to make sense of it. There's no logical explanation for how that man could have gotten ahead of me on the road, and the way he just vanished into thin air, it defies reality. Part of me wonders if I imagined the whole thing. Maybe I dozed off for a second while driving and had some kind of vivid waking nightmare. But it felt so real. I can still see those glinting eyes beneath the hood, that massive hand reaching for my car. I called in sick to work today. I can't bring myself to leave the house or drive anywhere. I know I should report it to the police, but what would I even say? I'm scared they'll think I'm crazy or on drugs or something. I don't know what to do. I can't stop thinking about it. Was it some kind of elaborate prank? A hallucination? Or something supernatural? I've never believed in ghosts or anything like that before, but now I'm not so sure. Whatever it was, I know I'll never forget that terrifying figure on the road. I don't think I'll ever feel safe driving alone at night again. Every time I close my eyes, I see that hooded shape lunging towards my car. I'm exhausted but too afraid to sleep. I guess I'm sharing this as a warning to others. Please be careful if you're driving in rural areas at night, especially if you're alone. I don't know if what I experienced was real or not, but I wouldn't wish that terror on anyone. I'm going to be looking over my shoulder for a long time. I keep wondering, what if I hadn't swerved in time? What would have happened if I'd hit him, or if I'd stopped the car? The thought makes me feel sick. I'm so thankful I made it home safely, but I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something truly horrific. Has anyone else experienced anything like this? Am I going crazy? I feel so alone and scared. I don't know how I'll ever feel safe driving at night again. Every shadow, every movement in my peripheral vision makes me jump now. I'm jumping at every little noise in my house. I know I need to try to move on and not let this control my life. But how do you get past something like this? How do you explain the unexplainable? I keep running through every possible rational explanation, but nothing fits. It just doesn't make sense. I'm sorry for rambling on so long. I guess I just needed to get this off my chest. If nothing else, writing it all out has helped me process it a bit. I'm still shaken and confused, but maybe sharing this will help me start to heal. And if it prevents even one person from going through what I did, then it's worth it. I don't know if I'll ever have answers about what really happened on that road. Maybe it's better not knowing. All I know is that I'll be avoiding rural drives at night for a very, very long time. Stay safe out there, everyone. You never know what might be lurking in the darkness. As I locked up my bike to run an order into a restaurant, I noticed two guys eyeing me from across the street. They looked rough, tattoos, hoods pulled low over their faces. My gut told me something was off, but I tried to ignore it. I'm used to all types in this city. When I came back out, they were still there, whispering to each other and glancing my way. I quickly hopped on my bike and took off, hoping to lose them in the sea of people and traffic. But as I pedaled down 7th Avenue, I realized they were following me. My heart started racing. I picked up speed, darting between cars and pedestrians. But every time I looked back, they were there, getting closer. I started yelling for help, but everyone just ignored me or gave me annoyed looks. This is New York, after all. People mind their own business. I was panicking now, unsure what to do. Should I ditch my bike and run? Try to find a cop? As I debated my options, one of the guys caught up to me and grabbed my backpack, nearly yanking me off the bike. I screamed and swerved, barely staying upright. That's when I spotted two NYPD officers up ahead. Relief washed over me as I yelled, "Help! These guys are attacking me!" The cops looked our way, hands moving to their holsters. But before I could reach them, a fist came out of nowhere and smashed into my left eye. Pain exploded through my head as I lost control of the bike and crashed hard onto the pavement. My vision went blurry, people were shouting, and I felt hands grabbing at me. I curled into a ball, waiting for more blows, but they never came. When I finally looked up, my attackers were gone. The cops were there, helping me to my feet and radioing for backup. "Which way did they go?" one asked urgently. I pointed vaguely down the street, still dazed. They took off running, but I knew it was hopeless. Those guys had vanished into the crowds in seconds. I sat on the curb, holding my throbbing eye as an ambulance was called. The whole thing probably lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. At the hospital, the doctors said I was lucky. No permanent damage to my eye, just heavy swelling and bruising. But the psychological damage was worse. I couldn't sleep for days, jumping at every sound and shadow. I kept replaying it in my head, wondering what I could have done differently. The cops took my statement, but I didn't have much to go on. Just vague descriptions of two guys in hoodies. I figured that was the end of it, just another unsolved crime in the big city. But a few days later I got a call from a detective. They'd arrested 2 suspects in a string of similar attacks on delivery drivers. They wanted me to come in for a lineup. I was terrified. What if the guys saw me and came after me again? But I knew I had to do it. When I walked into that room and saw them standing there behind the glass, my blood ran cold. It was definitely them. I'd never forget those faces. I pointed them out with shaking hands. The detective assured me they'd be going away for a long time. But even now, weeks later, I still don't feel safe. I quit DoorDash. Couldn't handle being out on the streets alone anymore. I'm scraping by on unemployment while I look for a new job, one where I don't have to constantly look over my shoulder. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing by identifying them. What if they have friends who come looking for revenge? But then I think about all the other drivers out there, just trying to make an honest living. If speaking up keeps even one of them from going through what I did, it's worth it. I never realized how vulnerable we are out there, racing around the city with no protection. You think you're safe in a crowded place like Times Square, but you're not. Danger can find you anywhere. I'm sharing my story as a warning to other delivery workers. Always be aware of your surroundings. And to everyone else, if you see someone in trouble, don't just look away. You could be saving a life. I still have nightmares about that night. The sound of footsteps behind me, the feeling of helplessness as I realized I was trapped. Sometimes in my dreams, the cops never show up and those guys catch me. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. The worst part is not knowing why they targeted me. Was it random, or had they been watching me? Did they want my money, my phone, or was it just for kicks? The uncertainty eats at me. I find myself suspicious of everyone now, always looking for potential threats. My family wants me to move back home to Ohio, saying the city's too dangerous. But this is my home now. I can't let fear drive me away. Still, I'm way more cautious these days. I vary my routes. I'm always checking my surroundings. I even signed up for self-defense classes, though I'm not sure how much good they do against two determined attackers. The bruises have faded, but the memory is still fresh. Every time I pass through Times Square now, my palms get sweaty and my heart races. I can't help but scan the crowds, half expecting to see those guys again. It's like the attack rewired my brain somehow. I've connected with other delivery drivers who've had similar experiences. We've started a support group, sharing safety tips and watching out for each other. It helps to know I'm not alone, but it's also scary to realize how common these attacks are. The cops say the guys who attacked me were part of a larger ring-targeting gig workers. Apparently, they'd scout out popular pickup spots and follow drivers to more isolated areas. It's chilling to think how organized it was, how many others they must have hurt. I testified at their preliminary hearing last week. Seeing them in the courtroom, in handcuffs, should have made me feel better. But it just brought it all flooding back. I could barely get the words out as I recounted what happened. They just sat there, stone-faced, like it was no big deal. Their lawyer tried to claim it was a case of mistaken identity, that I couldn't possibly remember their faces clearly in the chaos of the attack. But I know what I saw. Those faces are burned into my memory forever. The trial is set for next month. The prosecutor says, with my testimony and the evidence they've gathered from other attacks, it's a solid case. But until they're actually behind bars, I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe. I'm trying to move on with my life, to not let this define me. But it's hard. Every time I see a delivery guy on a bike, I want to warn them to be careful. Every time I hear about another attack in the news, I wonder if it's the same guys, if maybe they got out on bail somehow. Some days are better than others. I'm slowly getting back to my old routines, forcing myself to go out and live my life. But I'm changed, more cautious, more aware of the darkness that can lurk even in the brightest parts of the city. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe in New York again, but I'm determined not to let those guys win. They took my sense of security, but I won't let them take my home, my life. I'm still here, still fighting, and hopefully, by sharing my story, I can help keep others safe too. It's a daily battle, but I'm not giving up. This city has always been about survival of the fittest. I may have been knocked down, but I'm getting back up, stronger and smarter than before. Those guys thought they could break me, but they just made me more resilient. Whatever comes next, I'll be ready. We were all excited for a fun girls' night, watching movies, painting our nails, and staying up late gossiping. Around midnight, we finally settled down to sleep in the living room. Emily and Zoe crashed on the sofas while I laid out some blankets on the floor. We left my phone recording audio, just for fun. We sometimes like to listen back to our silly late-night conversations in the morning. I drifted off to sleep pretty quickly, lulled by the soft chirping of crickets outside. The next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by Emily frantically shaking me. "Wake up," she hissed. "I heard something weird." Groggily, I sat up and looked at the clock. It was just past 3 a.m. "What's going on?" I mumbled, still half asleep. Emily's eyes were wide with fear. "I heard a man's voice," she whispered, "coming from inside the house." That woke me up real fast. My heart started racing as I looked around the darkened living room. Nothing seemed out of place. Zoe was still fast asleep on the other couch. "Are you sure?" I asked Emily. "Maybe it was just the TV or something?" She shook her head vehemently. "No, the TV's off. I swear I heard a man say hello clear as day. It sounded like it was coming from the kitchen." A chill ran down my spine. There shouldn't be anyone else in the house. My parents weren't due back for days, and we'd locked all the doors before going to bed. "Let's check the recording," I suggested, reaching for my phone with trembling hands. We huddled close together as I pulled up the audio file and fast-forwarded to around 3 a.m. At first, there was just the usual nighttime background noise, our soft breathing, a car passing by outside. But then we heard it. A man's voice, speaking in a cheerful tone. "Hello?" Emily and I both gasped. It wasn't just in her imagination. There really had been someone in the house. But it got even creepier. A few seconds later, we heard the same voice again, this time in a panicked whisper. "Oh God, something's wrong." My blood ran cold. What did that mean? What was wrong? And more importantly, who was this man, and how did he get into my house? We quickly woke up Zoe and played her the recording. Her face went pale as she listened. "We need to get out of here," she said urgently. But we were too scared to move. What if the intruder was still in the house? We huddled together on the couch, clutching kitchen knives and staring wide-eyed at the darkness around us. Every creak of the house settling made us jump. As the sky slowly lightened outside, we finally worked up the courage to search the house. We moved from room to room, flicking on lights and checking closets and under beds. But we found nothing out of place. No sign of forced entry. No evidence that anyone had been there at all. If it weren't for that chilling audio recording, I would have thought we'd imagined the whole thing. But the proof was there, captured on my phone. An unknown man had somehow entered my home in the middle of the night, cheerfully greeted us, and then realized something was wrong. It made no sense. We called the police as soon as it was a reasonable hour. They came and dusted for fingerprints, checked the doors and windows, and listened to our recording. But they couldn't find any evidence of an intruder. They suggested it might have been someone outside the house whose voice carried through the open window. But that didn't explain the clarity of the audio or why he would say those specific things. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't sleep. Every noise in the night made me bolt upright in terror. I kept replaying that audio over and over, trying to make sense of it. Who was that man? How did he get in? What was wrong? And most disturbingly, why didn't he do anything to us while we slept? My parents installed a state-of-the-art security system after that night, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked and a chair wedged under the doorknob. I'd wake up multiple times each night in a cold sweat, convinced I'd heard that cheery hello again. Emily, Zoe, and I grew distant after that night. It was like we couldn't look at each other without being reminded of the terror we'd experienced. Our carefree sleepovers were a thing of the past. None of us wanted to be in that house after dark ever again. It's been almost a year now, and I still get chills thinking about it. I've developed a phobia of open windows. Even on the hottest summer nights, I keep everything tightly locked. The sound of crickets, once soothing, now fills me with dread. I've racked my brain trying to come up with a logical explanation. Could it have been a vivid shared nightmare? A glitch in the recording? Some kind of elaborate prank? But deep down, I know what I heard was real. Sometimes I wonder if that man is still out there, slipping silently into other people's homes at night. Does he stand over their beds, cheerfully greeting their sleeping forms? What exactly goes wrong that makes him flee? I may never know the answers, but one thing's for certain. I'll never again feel truly safe in my own home. That one inexplicable night shattered my sense of security forever. So please take it from me. Always lock your doors and windows at night. You never know who might be saying hello while you sleep. But slowly, things started to change. It was subtle at first, little comments here and there that made me doubt myself. He'd say things like, "You're lucky to have me," or "No one else would put up with you." I brushed it off, thinking he was just joking around, but the comments got more frequent and more hurtful. I remember the first time he really scared me. We were at a party, and I was talking to one of my male friends. Tom came over, grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises, and hissed in my ear that if I ever talked to another guy again, he'd make me regret it. I was shocked and terrified. This wasn't the Tom I knew. After that, things escalated quickly. He'd constantly accuse me of cheating, even though I never gave him any reason to doubt me. He'd go through my phone, interrogate me about every text and call. If I didn't answer his messages within minutes, he'd blow up my phone with angry texts and voicemails. I started to withdraw from my friends and family. Tom didn't like me spending time with anyone but him. He'd say things like, "They don't really care about you," or "I'm the only one who truly loves you." I believed him. I thought he was protecting me, that he just loved me so much he couldn't bear to share me with anyone else. One day, I found out that Tom's dad had been arrested for domestic violence. It suddenly made so much sense, the way Tom would flinch when someone raised their voice, how he'd get this look of pure rage in his eyes when he was angry. I felt sorry for him, thinking about what he must have gone through. I convinced myself that I could help him, that my love could heal his pain. But it only got worse. He started threatening to hurt himself if I ever left him. He'd say things like, "I can't live without you, and if you leave me, I'll kill myself." I felt trapped, responsible for his well-being. I was terrified of what he might do if I tried to end things. The final straw came on prom night. I'd spent weeks planning the perfect evening, picking out my dress, getting my hair and makeup done. Tom had promised to meet me at the venue, but as the night wore on, he was nowhere to be seen. I called and texted but got no response. Finally, around midnight, I got a text from him saying he was at a party across town and had met someone better. I was devastated. All those months of manipulation and abuse, and he had the nerve to cheat on me on prom night. I finally found the strength to end things, blocking his number and cutting off all contact. It was hard, but I slowly started to rebuild my life. Years passed, and I thought I'd put Tom behind me. I went to college, made new friends, even started dating again. But then, out of the blue, I got a Facebook message from him. At first, I ignored it, but the messages kept coming. He'd write long, rambling paragraphs about how sorry he was, how he'd changed, how he needed me. I learned that he'd developed a serious drinking problem and had been diagnosed with several mental health issues. Part of me felt sorry for him, but a bigger part was terrified. The messages became more frequent and more disturbing. He'd send photos of places we used to go together, saying he could still smell my perfume there. He'd describe in detail things we'd done years ago, things I'd tried so hard to forget. It was like he was trying to pull me back into that dark place we'd been in together. I blocked him on Facebook, but he found other ways to contact me. He'd create new email addresses, use different phone numbers. It felt like I couldn't escape him. I started having nightmares, reliving all the awful things he'd done to me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced he was in my room. The final straw came when I found a note taped to my apartment door. It said, "I'll always find you." That's when I knew I had to take action. I went to the police and filed for a restraining order. I installed security cameras and changed all my locks. Even now, years later, I still look over my shoulder everywhere I go. I'm afraid to form close relationships, always worried that someone might turn out to be like Tom. The psychological scars run deep, and I'm not sure they'll ever fully heal. I share this story as a warning to others. Abuse doesn't always look like bruises and black eyes. Sometimes it's subtle, insidious, creeping into your life so slowly you don't even realize it's happening until you're in too deep. If you see the signs, get out. Don't let anyone make you feel less than you are. You deserve better. Looking back, I can see all the red flags I missed. The jealousy, the control, the manipulation. It was all there from the beginning. But when you're young and in love, it's easy to mistake possessiveness for passion, control for care. I've spent years in therapy, trying to understand why I stayed with Tom for so long, why I let him treat me that way. I've learned that it wasn't my fault, that abusers are skilled at making their victims feel worthless and dependent. But it's still hard not to blame myself sometimes. The hardest part is the lingering effects. Even now, in healthy relationships, I find myself flinching at raised voices or apologizing for things that aren't my fault. I have to constantly remind myself that not everyone is like Tom, that it's okay to trust and be vulnerable. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed with Tom. Would he have eventually become physically violent? Would I have lost myself completely? It's scary to think about how close I came to a life of constant fear and pain. I hope that by sharing my story, I can help others recognize the signs of emotional abuse. It's not always easy to see when you're in the middle of it, but from the outside, the patterns are clear. If your partner makes you feel constantly on edge, if they isolate you from friends and family, if they make you doubt your own perceptions, these are all huge red flags. To anyone out there who might be in a similar situation, you are strong. You are worthy of love and respect, and you can get out. It won't be easy, but I promise you, it's worth it. There's a whole world of healthy, loving relationships waiting for you on the other side of abuse. As for me, I'm still healing. Some days are harder than others, but I'm proud of how far I've come, and I'm hopeful for the future. Tom no longer has power over me. I've reclaimed my life, and I'm never letting anyone take it away again. I never thought I'd be writing this, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest. It all started about a month ago. I'm 16 and live with my parents in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Nothing exciting ever happens here, which is why this whole thing has been so unsettling. It was a normal Tuesday afternoon. I had just gotten home from school and was sitting on the front porch, playing with my phone while our two golden retrievers, Max and Buddy, lounged in the sun nearby. That's when I first noticed him. A man I'd never seen before walking down our street. He looked to be in his 40s, average height and build, with graying hair. Nothing particularly remarkable about him. As he passed by our house, he smiled and waved. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" he called out cheerfully. I gave a polite nod and smile back, not thinking much of it. Lots of people walk through the neighborhood after all, but then I saw him again the next day, and the day after that. He always seemed to time his walks for right when I got home from school. Each time he'd wave and make some friendly comment about the weather or compliment our dogs. At first I thought it was just a coincidence, but after about a week of this, I started to feel uneasy. I mentioned it to my mom, but she brushed it off. "He's probably just a neighbor out for his daily walk," she said. "As long as he's not bothering you, I wouldn't worry about it." But something about him just felt off. The way he looked at me gave me chills. His eyes seemed to linger a bit too long, his smile a bit too wide. I started dreading coming home from school, knowing he'd be there. Things escalated about 2 weeks in. It was a Saturday, and I was in the backyard playing fetch with Max and Buddy. Suddenly, I heard a voice from the other side of our fence. "Those are some fine-looking dogs you've got there." I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was him peering over our fence with that too wide smile. How long had he been watching me? Thanks," I stammered, gathering the dogs and hurrying inside. My heart was pounding. This was getting seriously creepy. From then on, I started noticing him at odd times, not just on his usual afternoon walks. I'd see him standing across the street early in the morning as I left for school. Once I spotted him at the end of our block late at night when I got home from a friend's house. I begged my parents to take it seriously, but they still seemed to think I was overreacting. "He hasn't actually done anything wrong," my dad pointed out. "We can't call the police just because a guy walks by our house." But I knew something wasn't right. I started changing my routine, varying the times I left for school and came home. I stopped sitting outside or playing with the dogs in the yard. I felt like a prisoner in my own home. The final straw came last Friday. I was taking out the trash, and there he was, standing at the end of our driveway. Before I could react, he walked right up to me. "I brought you a gift," he said in a low voice, reaching into his pocket. My blood ran cold as he pulled out a dead rat, dangling it by its tail. "I thought your dogs might like a new chew toy." I screamed and ran inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. I was shaking uncontrollably as I told my parents what happened. Finally, they believed me. We called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man was long gone. We filed a report, but without knowing his name or address, there wasn't much they could do. They promised to increase patrols in the area and told us to call immediately if we saw him again. It's been 5 days now, and there's been no sign of him. But I'm still terrified. I jump at every sound, convinced he's lurking just out of sight. I can't sleep, can't focus at school. Every time I close my eyes, I see that dead rat swinging from his hand. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. Was he just a lonely, socially awkward guy who didn't realize how creepy he was being? Or did he have something much worse planned? The not knowing is almost worse than anything else. My parents are talking about moving, but I don't know if that will help. What if he follows us? What if he finds me again? I feel so helpless and afraid. This quiet neighborhood I've lived in my whole life suddenly feels sinister and threatening. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe here again. I keep replaying every interaction in my head, wondering if there were signs I missed. Should I have spoken up sooner? Done something differently? I know it's not my fault, but I can't help feeling guilty somehow. The police say to call if we see him again, but what good will that do? By the time they arrive, he could be long gone, or worse, he could have already done something terrible. I'm writing this partly to warn others to trust their instincts. If someone is making you uncomfortable, speak up. Don't let anyone tell you you're overreacting. Better to be safe than sorry. But I'm also writing because I'm desperate for advice. Has anyone else experienced something like this? How did you handle it? How do you ever feel safe again? For now, I'm just taking it one day at a time. My parents have installed security cameras and I never go anywhere alone. But I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if he's watching me right now. Will I ever be able to relax in my own home again? Will I ever stop being afraid? I don't know. But I do know that I'll never forget the terror of those weeks, or the sight of that man's twisted smile as he held out that dead rat. If you're reading this and something similar is happening to you, please don't wait to get help. Tell someone you trust. Call the police. Do whatever you need to do to stay safe. Don't let fear paralyze you like it did me. I don't know what's going to happen next. Maybe he's gone for good. Maybe he'll be back tomorrow. All I can do is stay vigilant and hope that someday I'll feel safe again. But for now, every passing car, every shadow, every unexpected noise fills me with dread. I never thought I'd be afraid in my own home, but here I am, jumping at shadows and sleeping with the lights on, all because of a strange man who decided to make me the target of his disturbing attentions. I still remember that morning like it was yesterday, even though it's been over a year now. I was 16 at the time, enjoying my usual routine of sitting on the front porch with a cup of hot chocolate, watching the neighborhood wake up. It was a crisp autumn day, leaves crunching under the feet of early joggers and dog walkers. At first, I didn't think much of the man who walked by. He looked rough, dirty clothes, unkempt beard, tired eyes. But lots of people in our area were struggling, so I just gave a polite nod when he waved. He mumbled something that sounded like "morning" and kept walking. The next day, I noticed him again. Same time, same direction. This time he slowed down as he passed our house, making eye contact a bit longer than felt comfortable. I shifted in my seat, suddenly very aware that I was alone out there. By the third day, I was on edge before I even saw him. Sure enough, right on schedule, there he was. But this time he stopped completely, right at the edge of our property. He just stood there, staring at me. My heart was pounding. I wanted to run inside, but I was afraid any sudden movement might provoke him. After what felt like an eternity, he finally moved on. I told my parents that night. They were concerned but tried to reassure me. Probably just a harmless homeless guy, they said. Maybe he was hoping for some food or money. They said to let them know if it kept happening. It did keep happening. Every single morning for the next week, without fail. Sometimes he'd just walk by. Other times he'd linger. Once he called out, "You're always so pretty in the morning." I felt sick to my stomach. I started changing up my routine. I'd wait until later to go outside, or I'd peek out the window first. But somehow, he always seemed to know when I was there. If I delayed, he'd just keep walking by the house, back and forth, until I appeared. Things escalated about 2 weeks in. I was running late for school and rushed out the front door without thinking. He was right there, at the end of our driveway. Before I could react, he was walking towards me, grinning. "There you are, sweetheart. I was worried about you." I've never felt fear like that before. My whole body went cold. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. He got within a few feet of me before our neighbor's dog started barking like crazy. It snapped me out of my frozen state and I bolted back inside, slamming and locking the door. My parents called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man was long gone. They took a report, said they'd keep an eye out, but didn't seem too concerned. Just another creep, they implied. Be careful, don't engage. But it wasn't over. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a tapping sound. Groggy and confused, I went to my window, and there he was, standing in our backyard, tapping on my window, grinning up at me. I screamed so loud I'm surprised the whole neighborhood didn't wake up. My dad ran outside with a baseball bat, but once again the man had vanished. We called the police again. This time they took it more seriously, did a thorough search of the area. Nothing. The next few days were a blur of fear and paranoia. I didn't want to be alone in the house. I jumped at every sound. My parents took turns staying home from work to be with me. We installed security cameras and new locks, but he never came during the day anymore. It was always at night. We'd wake up to find strange things in the yard, a doll with its eyes gouged out, dead flowers arranged in a heart shape, a photo of me that had been taken without my knowledge. The police increased patrols in our area. Neighbors were on high alert. But somehow, he always managed to slip through unseen. The only evidence of his visits were the gifts he'd leave and the occasional glimpse of his retreating figure on our security footage. One night, about a month into this nightmare, I woke up feeling wrong. I can't explain it, but I knew something was off. I crept to my window and peeked out. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed our shed door was open. I don't know what possessed me, but I felt compelled to go look. Maybe I thought if I confronted this head-on, it would finally end. I snuck downstairs and out the back door, heart pounding so hard I was sure it would wake my parents. As I approached the shed, I heard rustling inside. I grabbed a shovel leaning against the side and took a deep breath. "I know you're in there," I called out, my voice shaking. "Come out now or I'm calling the police." The rustling stopped. For a long moment, there was complete silence. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. But it wasn't the man who emerged. It was me, or something that looked exactly like me, down to the pajamas I was wearing. It smiled, my own smile, but wrong somehow. Empty, cold. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming. The thing that looked like me took a step forward, still smiling, that awful smile. "Time to switch places," it said in my voice. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, back into the house, up the stairs, into my parents' room. I was babbling, hysterical, trying to explain what I'd seen. They calmed me down, assured me it was just a nightmare. My dad went to check the shed. Empty, of course. No sign anyone had been there. I knew what I saw. I know it wasn't a dream, but I also know how crazy it sounds. After that night, the visits stopped. No more gifts, no more sightings. It was like it had never happened. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. The stress, the fear, maybe it all just broke me for a while. But then I'll catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror, and for a split second, I'll see that empty smile. And I know, deep down, that something is still very, very wrong. I don't sit on the porch anymore. I don't look out windows at night. And I never, ever open the shed, because I'm terrified of what or who I might find inside.